Chapter 1753. Especially when they knew that there was a supreme emperor above them, those in despair were even more unwilling to call themselves despair. After all, calling themselves despair was simply a constant reminder that they were in despair. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easy to change the way they addressed themselves. In comparison, the Supreme Emperor was obviously different. Supreme Emperor was an honorific title in itself, and it represented his status. Normal supreme sovereigns were obviously very satisfied with the way they were addressed. As a result, even if they knew that the Level 9 False Saint realm division seemed to be more accurate and orderly, they were still unwilling to include themselves in it. Due to the appearance of the Level 9 False Saint cultivation system, the cultivation world of this world became more and more orderly. It also caused the various cultivation civilizations to have a more detailed division. All kinds of corresponding cultivation methods rapidly emerged like a flash flood, causing the cultivation civilization of this world to become more and more prosperous. The change of a name caused such a huge change. This seemed unbelievable, but in fact it was very normal. There were countless intelligent people in this world, and in almost every generation, there were hundreds of millions of living beings who could establish their own sections. However, not all of these living beings were able to establish their own sects and clans. Perhaps it was because of the limitations of their own ideas, or because their opportunities were not smooth, but most of them unknowingly became ordinary people. They gradually became the same as ordinary people, and there was nothing special about them. In other words, the vast majority of intelligent people had unknowingly wasted their talent. Unknowingly, they were unable to unleash their potential due to various accidents. Under such circumstances, this more detailed division of realms allowed them to directly understand how realms were raised. It made them understand that they were still not at the peak of the entire cultivation system. They were only at a certain level that was neither high nor low or extremely low. This kind of understanding would naturally bring about a sense of crisis. And this sense of crisis, it was the existence that could stimulate one's potential the most. Therefore, among the many intelligent living beings who had their talent wasted, a large portion of them were naturally able to stimulate their own potential. There was not a need for too many of these living beings to stimulate their potential. Just a small portion was enough to cause earth-shattering changes to the cultivation world of this world. As a result, the number of new cultivation methods being born in this world was several times, a dozen times, or even dozens of times more than before. This kind of change made the Level 9 False Saint cultivation system become more and more popular. It was even more deeply ingrained in people's hearts. In just tens of thousands of years, there were no other cultivation realms in this world. The Level 9 False Saint cultivation system had become the only cultivation system in this world. In fact, due to the prevalence of this concept, even the Supreme Emperor, who was originally not included in this Level 9 False Sage cultivation system, was unknowingly included in this cultivation system. Of course, he was still a Supreme Emperor, even if he was included in this system. However, he did not abolish the title of Supreme Emperor. However, this form of address had already turned into a true honorific. Level 7 False Saint. He was known as the first level Supreme Emperor. Level 8 False Sages were known as Level 2 Supreme Emperors. Level 9 False Sages were known as Level 3 Supreme Emperors. This kind of change was already a fundamental change. This kind of change happened naturally. When the many Supreme Emperors noticed this, things had already developed to a point where it could not be changed. Unless those Supreme Emperors could really abolish this title, it could be predicted. From now on, below true sages, only false sages were left among the many Supreme Emperors. There was no lack of people who noticed this change. World Emperor. He was one of them. Compared to the other Supreme Emperors, the other false sages did not know the source of all these changes. However, as the one who had constructed the Ripple Passage and those cultivation holy lands, he was quite clear about the source of all these changes. I didn't expect that just projecting the mysteries of the connate indestructible spiritual light would be able to change space-time. He occasionally sighed inexplicably. After sighing, he felt an inexplicable sense of loss in his heart. It seemed that ever since Luo Fan stepped into this world, all the changes in this world had something to do with him. The perfection of the world was because he had created the connate Tao physique from the living beings he had enlightened. The world had survived the great calamity of the world because he had used some unknown method to summon the body of the true sage. Even now, the true perfection of the cultivation system of the world was actually because of him, as an existence that had existed in this world for countless trillions of years. The World Emperor felt an indescribable emotion when he occasionally thought of this. However, as time passed, he had gradually acknowledged Luo Fan's strength. The unwillingness in his heart had also gradually subsided. On the contrary, an inexplicable anticipation arose in his heart. According to the World Emperor's understanding, every great calamity of the world had an opportunity to become a true sage. And according to Luo Fan's performance, it was obvious that he would be the one to obtain this opportunity. What he was looking forward to was when Luo Fan would be able to digest this opportunity and become a true sage. While the many supreme emperors were amazed by the changes in this world, and the World Emperor was looking forward to when Luo Fan would become a true sage, time passed by quickly. In the blink of an eye, 100 million years had passed. In these 100 million years, there were more than 1 million false sages of level 4 and above born in this world. Among them, there were more than 1,000 false sages of level 7 and above, which was also the supreme emperors. The strength of this world was more than 100 times stronger than when it had just survived the great calamity of the world. In addition, there were already more than 1 billion existences that had become false sages. Although it was still not comparable to the level before this world had survived the first great calamity of the world, the false sages that had become false sages in these 100 million years had all been cultivated bit by bit. Every single one of them had an extremely stable foundation, and their strength was more than 10 times stronger than those false sages that had naturally become false sages due to the perfection of the world. From this point of view, compared to the past, the strength of this world was much stronger. It was much stronger. However, even though there were already so many false sages, this number was still nothing compared to this vast world. After so many false sages were scattered in this vast and boundless world, the land was still vast and sparsely populated. In fact, the territories of many false sages didn't even intersect much. Even the number of false sages had increased by so much, so the number of other cultivators had naturally increased by even more. Among them, the civilized country in this world had already grown to an unimaginable level. If one were to calculate, there were traces of that civilized country everywhere in the entire world. It was obviously impossible to maintain unity in such a vast and huge civilized country. Now, the entire civilized country had already turned into an alliance. And in this alliance it was divided into countries. And the number of China countries was calculated in hundreds of millions of trillions. In this country that was calculated in hundreds of millions of trillions, there were no countries that were thousands of kilometers or tens of thousands of people. Every country had at least 1 billion people. Among them were the real big countries. There were even trillions and hundreds of trillions of people. In this way, it could be seen to what extent the entire world had grown. However, even so, this world still didn't have any problems with resources. With such a large population, a civilization that had developed to such a level wasn't considered insignificant compared to this world. However, this world could easily accommodate it. The resources consumed by countless trillions of countries couldn't even be compared to the resources that were produced at every moment in this world. Under such circumstances, that civilized country naturally didn't have any problems with resources. Although there were wars because of resources, there were also wars. However, it couldn't affect all the civilized countries in this world, and with more than 1 billion false sages, it was actually already enough to form an extremely prosperous false sage civilization. Now, at the highest point of the world, another world had been opened up. This world was created by the joint efforts of many false sages. Within it, it connected to the cave abode of every false sage and contained the cultivation path of every false sage. Although this world wasn't as stable and strong as the world below that had gone through the great tribulation of heaven and earth, however, it wasn't something that an ordinary world could compare to. In this world, all the false sages were like ordinary living beings, living in it. Due to the characteristics of the false sage civilization, they didn't have any professions like peddlers and pawns. However, there were professions of a higher level that had similar performance. Due to the blessing of many false sages, the buildings in this world became beautiful, becoming an incomparably beautiful world. Of course, this was just a world where many false sages usually lived and communicated. In a normal world, they still became the guardians of various civilized countries, nurturing various cultivation civilizations, and had many powerful cultivators under their command. In this false sage civilization, there was a false sage who occupied a supreme position. That was the world emperor. In fact, although the establishment of this false sage civilization was the general trend, it was also the result of the world emperor's actions. The world emperor wholeheartedly wanted the power of this world to continuously increase so that he could go further and further in the great tribulation of heaven and earth. If he could survive the 9th great tribulation of heaven and earth in the end and make this world a true great world, of course that would be for the best. Obviously, the establishment of this false sage civilization was extremely beneficial to his goal. In the false sage civilization, any false sage would become an ordinary person like others. The arrogance in their hearts would naturally be suppressed. Without this kind of arrogance, they would naturally know how to struggle, and they would know how to pursue greater power. This kind of pursuit was obviously the most important to a false sage. For existences at the level of a false sage, there was no need to mention their wisdom, and opportunities. In fact, the only thing that restricted their improvement was their own mind. If they dispelled the arrogance in their hearts and truly understood their own weakness, they would truly understand that they still needed to continue cultivating in order to obtain a higher chance of survival. Then, the potential that they could unleash. It would definitely be strengthened to an incomparably terrifying level. It was naturally unrealistic for each of them to be able to easily break through the barrier between a false sage and a despair, which was the barrier between a level 3 and a level 4 false sage. However, it was definitely not a pipe dream for them to increase their respective realms by 1 or 2 levels. Even if it was just an increase of 1 level, the overall increase in strength was already quite considerable, and it was enough to move the world emperor. It was precisely because of this that the world emperor pushed for the establishment of this false sage civilization. In order to truly allow this false sage civilization to exist in an orderly and long-term manner, he even abandoned the title of a level 3 emperor and directly called himself a level 9 false sage. He was also the only level 9 false sage in this false sage civilization. In this false sage civilization, he was the supreme king, ruling over everything in this false sage civilization and maintaining the order of the entire false sage civilization. Because of his existence, almost all the level 2 emperors and level 1 supreme emperors had joined this false sage civilization. As a result, it made the fake saint civilization seem like a magnificent sight. It seemed extremely prosperous. However, the other emperors did not sacrifice themselves like the world emperor. They had never claimed to be a level 7 or level 8 false sage. All of them only admitted that they were level 1 or level 2 emperors. However, this was already enough for this false sage civilization. As for the other level 3 supreme emperors, They were obviously not as concerned about this world as the World Emperor. To them, the existence of this world would allow them to cultivate more comfortably. However, if this world was destroyed, it would only be slightly more troublesome for them to cultivate. Under such circumstances, they naturally had no interest in playing games with other false sages. As for the remaining Level 1 Emperors, Level 2 Emperors were existences who would fight for the three connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Of course, they had no interest in playing games with this false sage civilization. On this day, in the space-time of this false sage civilization in the Supreme Palace, the World Emperor's heart trembled. He summoned a false sage and said, "Go to that area and clean up the surrounding space-time." His words contained an inexplicable power. As soon as he said that, the other party received countless complicated information. He naturally understood what area that was and how to clean up the spacetime. Immediately, the false sage responded sternly. After that, he bade farewell to the World Emperor and directly crossed spacetime, descending into a normal spacetime and arriving at a spiritual mountain. This spirited mountain was none other than the spirited mountain where Luo Fan had opened his Immortal's Cave. However, compared to the past, there were already traces of countless cultivators' activities in this spacetime. There were mysterious cultivation ruins everywhere, and an indescribable spacetime was hidden in the depths of this spacetime. In fact, there were more than 10 sects that had set their sex here, causing this place to lose the peace it had before. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the cultivation environment here was simply too wonderful. As the place where Luo Fan had opened his cave abode, and the place where the World Emperor's power had spread and fused, the cultivation environment here was not the most wonderful place in this world. However, it was definitely an existence that occupied the top position. If a cultivator discovered such a cultivation place, how could they let it go? Although Luo Fan's existence was not a secret to the upper echelons, it was definitely a secret to the cultivators at the lower echelons who had yet to become false sages. Therefore, naturally, more and more cultivators opened their cave abodes and sects here. As time passed, generation after generation, until now, hundreds of millions of years had passed. Naturally, it had evolved into what it was today. At this moment, among the cultivator sects that occupied this spiritual mountain, the highest cultivation level was only a stage 9 false sage. This kind of strength was, of course, supreme in the cultivation world below false sage. However, to a false sage, any one of them, even the weakest level 1 false sage, could easily destroy millions. Moreover, the person who had arrived at this moment was a level 6 false sage who could listen to the World Emperor. This false sage had arrived here. He could not even be bothered to speak to the cultivators here. With a thought, a powerful aura erupted. It brazenly pressed down. Following this aura, the spiritual mountain began to tremble slightly. Among the countless formations that existed, there were countless of them. Countless defenses were quickly shattered. One cultivator after another rushed out from their cultivation places in shock, searching for the source of this aura. When they saw the existence floating above them with a sage-like demeanor and an aura that seemed to control the heavens and earth, as well as a faintly discernible glow floating behind his head, they were all shocked. "Everyone, leave this place for 3 light years," the level 6 false sage said indifferently. These words. It was as if the laws of heaven and earth had been engraved into the hearts of all the cultivators. All of them instinctively unleashed their abilities and flew 3 light years away from this place, without even having the time to think, or even think about what they were thinking. To mortals, a distance of 3 light years was a distance that they would never be able to reach in their entire lives. However, to false sages, even quasi-sages, an innate grand heavenly realm existences, it was only an extremely short distance. In just a few breaths, they were already 3 light years away. In this area, Only those cultivators who had yet to reach the innate grand heavenly realm were moving forward with difficulty. Seeing this scene, the level 6 false sage frowned. With a wave of his hand, an indescribable power spread out and swept across the spiritual mountain. In an instant, all the cultivators here, regardless of whether they were strong or weak, were sent 3 light years away. At this point, the false sages and quasi-sages finally regained their senses, and all of them had an extremely shocked expression on their faces. False sages are indeed extremely powerful, someone exclaimed. However, everyone could not help but nod their heads. After sending all the cultivators away, the level 6 false sage finally took action. His power surged. Many mysterious true sage divine abilities exploded from his body and blasted into the space-time. It quickly scanned through the space and time within a 3 light-year radius, as well as all the laws and laws within this area. As the true sage ability swept through, the many methods that generations of cultivators had added to it were quickly broken. The space-time that had been opened up by the cultivators in the past as treasure vaults and ruins was destroyed one by one. The things that existed in them were all turned into power and poured into the normal space-time, gradually merging into the world. All kinds of powerful concealment formations, powerful treasures, the subtle distortions of laws, and the changes in space-time were also quickly eliminated. In just a few breaths of time, the area within 3 light years of the spirited mountain surpassing territory had become clear. There was no longer any man-made object in the area. Or, to be more precise, other than the space-time where Luo Fan acted as the cave abode, there were no other man-made things. After doing all of this, the level 6 false sage checked again. After discovering that there were no more mistakes, he did not dare to stay any longer. With a movement of his body, he turned into a stream of light and charged into the world of the false sage civilization. He headed to the Supreme Palace to report to the World Emperor. Everything that he did was seen by many of the false saints and false saints who had opened up cave abodes and sects in the spirited mountain surpassing realm. At this moment they were all dumbfounded and did not know how to react. Generations of their ancestors had managed this place for millions of years, tens of millions of years, yet it was so easily destroyed. The treasures that had been accumulated for countless generations had completely disappeared. Everything in the entire mountain gate had been completely lost. This was already a great shock to them, enough to make them feel extremely resentful. However, they realized that what they had lost was only a very small part of the area that they had stayed in for millions or even tens of millions of years. It turned out that there were so many space-time, so many ruins, and so many treasures hidden in the place where they lived. They had actually been lying on the treasures all this time without knowing it. Chapter 1754. Naturally, no one cared about the complicated emotions in the hearts of the cultivators at this moment. At this moment, there was a strange fluctuation in the spirited mountain surpassing grounds. It suddenly appeared out of nowhere and enveloped the entire spirited mountain surpassing grounds. At first, the cultivators did not notice the existence of this fluctuation. However, as the fluctuation became stronger and more obvious, they gradually discovered that the spiritual mountain surpassing realm was undergoing an indescribable change. A very familiar yet very strange feeling emanated from the spirited mountain surpassing region. This indescribable feeling was so unbelievable that it made them feel as if they had been in this spiritual mountain surpassing realm for hundreds of millions of years. It also felt as if this was the first time they had seen this spiritual mountain surpassing realm. It was as if something that they could not discover or understand had suddenly happened in this place from the inside out. The fluctuation became more and more obvious and intense. In the end, it caused a faint layer of strange barrier to gradually appear around the spiritual mountain surpassing realm. This layer of barrier directly isolated the spiritual mountain surpassing realm from the inside out, causing the spiritual mountain surpassing realm to seem to become a completely independent, complete spacetime. The connection with the outside world seemed to have been completely severed and isolated. At this moment, the cultivators could not sense the existence of the fluctuation at all. They could only see from afar that the barrier seemed to be becoming thicker and more obvious. In the end, it completely blocked their line of sight, causing them to be unable to see the scene of the spiritual mountain surpassing realm at all. These were only pseudo-sage and quasi-sage cultivators. They could not see the changes within, but the realm emperor in the pseudo-sage civilization saw everything. At this moment, he frowned slightly. His expression was filled with indescribable doubt. How could this be? It seems like nothing has changed, but it also seems like everything has changed. He knew it when he felt something in his heart. This was when Luo Fan was about to come out of seclusion. Moreover, through the feeling in his heart, he knew that his coming out of seclusion would definitely cause extremely serious consequences. Therefore, just now, he had directly ordered his level 6 pseudosage to clean up the space-time of the spiritual mountain surpassing realm. However, his premonition was only at this step. As for what kind of change would occur, or where the true source of that change was, he did not know at all. He did not understand at all. It was only under such circumstances that it would appear. At this moment, he was completely confused by the changes in front of him. He couldn't see them clearly at all. Don't understand the performance. How is this possible? Has the gap between us really reached such a level? I can't even understand the vision he produced when he came out of closed-door training. Such a thought flashed through the World King's mind at this time. His expression became extremely unsightly because of this thought. Although he admitted that he was not as good as Luo Fan, as the most experienced level 3 emperor in this world, or rather, a level 9 false sage, the world emperor still had a lot of confidence in himself. Under such circumstances, even if he thought he was inferior to someone, he would never truly believe that there was a world of difference between him and the other party. In other words, even if he admitted that he wasn't as good as Luo Fan, he would never admit that he couldn't even see through Luo Fan's tricks. But everything that happened before his eyes told him that the gap between him and Luo Fan had indeed reached such a level. Indeed, he couldn't find out what methods Luo Fan was using. While he was feeling bitter, the World King's expression became more and more ugly. While the World King was in a dilemma, the changes in Luo Fan's cave abode became more and more obvious. Under the transformation of that inexplicable fluctuation, the nomological layer, time, space, matter, energy, and so on in that area all underwent some extremely subtle changes. It was extremely mysterious, but it was also a change that no other living being could understand. Under that kind of change, that area seemed to have some kind of imprint that everyone who knew Luo Fan was familiar with. The imprint that belonged to Luo Fan. Of course, this was just a feeling, and he didn't really find a real imprint in it. After an unknown period of time, it seemed like an instant, but it also seemed like several years. At a certain moment, an indescribable thunderous sound suddenly came from the depths of space-time. As this sound traveled out of the car, the law layer within the area suddenly collapsed. All the rules and laws were instantly shattered, turning into tiny fragments that filled the entire area in the form of smoke. With the collapse of the nomological layer, the 4 basic existences in that area, time, space, matter, and energy, fell into absolute chaos. Vaguely, some kind of indescribable, dusky luster emerged from that area. The entire area seemed to have turned into a state of chaos in the blink of an eye. Amidst this chaos, a space-time gradually emerged from that chaos. This space-time was extremely mysterious, with countless nomological laws entangled on its surface, forming an incredible array that firmly protected this space-time, making it difficult for any changes in the outside world to affect anything in that space-time. And at this moment, this space-time also produced all kinds of indescribable changes. The nomological laws on the surface of that space-time began to shatter bit by bit, and the array formed by nomological laws began to gradually collapse, turning into bits and pieces of nomological laws that gradually integrated into the surrounding chaos, gradually making the surrounding chaos one step further. As the nomological laws shattered, the space-time also began to shatter bit by bit. More and more of the four basic existences, time, space, matter, and energy, merged into the surrounding chaos. Amidst this endless chaos, a speck of light gradually appeared. This speck of light was extremely mysterious, and its luster couldn't even be described with words. Looking at this light, one could only feel one thing: this was just a kind of light. The light became more and more obvious and more intense. An indescribable suppressive force pressed down on the surrounding chaos at this moment. It gradually calmed down, and the nomological layer began to re-establish itself. At the same time, it also made the four basic existences follow the nomological layer once more to form a world. After an unknown amount of time, everything calmed down. That radiance also revealed the truth of the matter. It was actually four figures. Among them, standing in the middle, was a young man with a constantly rotating halo behind his head. It was impressively Luo Fan. Beside him, there were two women and one man. They were obviously Qing Yi Yuji and Gui Shou. At this moment, as Luo Fan stood there, his entire body emanated an incomparably strong and obvious nomological aura. His entire being was like the materialization of the nomological worldview. As soon as he appeared, he would naturally change the surrounding spacetime. He allowed the surrounding spacetime to naturally restructure according to the nomological worldview, allowing its essence to completely adapt to Luo Fan's changes. This was also the root cause of the many changes that had occurred in the spirited mountain surpassing boundary before he came out of seclusion. Compared to him, around him, Qing Yi Yuji and Gui Shou were emanating an extremely strong aura of a supreme emperor. Compared to 100 million years ago, the three of them had made great progress. Among them, the most obvious improvement was Qing Yi and Yuji. At this moment, apart from the emperor aura on their bodies, there were also traces of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was also the aura of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. It was an aura that was eternal and indestructible. Although they weren't true third-level emperors yet, they were only half a step away. The only difference was that they had completely taken possession of the two innate inextinguishable spiritual lights that Luo Fan had bestowed upon them. Compared to the great progress of the two of them, Gui Shou's progress was a little smaller than theirs, but it was still quite significant. Currently, his strength wasn't inferior to any third-grade monarch at all. Although he hadn't mastered the innate inextinguishable spiritual light, with the various understandings of the true divine abilities and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light that he had obtained from Luo Fan, he was now able to display the strength that he could display with the help of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush. Even if he were to face a world emperor, he wouldn't be too far behind. The reason why he said that his progress was smaller than Qing Yi and Yuji's was because he hadn't broken through to the next realm. With my understanding, you don't need to worry about anything in this world anymore. Go and cultivate now, Luo Fan said indifferently as he swept his gaze across the three people beside him. His words also contained the kind of worldview that no living creature in this world could understand. When it entered the ears of the three people, it seemed to form a kind of mark in their hearts. However, it was only faintly discernible. The imprint seemed to be lacking something, and could not be completely condensed. It could only show a slight tendency to condense before it naturally scattered. It was unable to truly remain in their hearts. Not to mention entering the depths of the origin of life. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Qing Yi and the other two were slightly at a loss. Ever since Luo Fan came out of seclusion, everything that he said made them feel extremely strange. It was as if there were many mysteries that could benefit them, but they couldn't distinguish them or remember them no matter how hard they tried. After a long while, they finally reacted and bowed to Luo Fan. After apologizing, they left under Luo Fan's urging. They either returned to their innate inextinguishable spiritual light or returned to the underworld. As they left, Luo Fan's heart trembled. With a wave of his hand, the change in the surrounding spacetime, or the change in the worldview, that was, the change in the worldview, abruptly disappeared. The essence had returned to how it was before Luo Fan came out of seclusion. Even the barrier that had appeared around the spirited mountain's surpassing territory gradually dissipated. Not long after, everything returned to normal. Apart from the fact that the terrain of the spiritual mountain's surreal domain was completely different from before, after doing all this, Luo Fan sighed slightly. With a wave of his hand, the innate inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head fell into his hand. It gradually changed and directly turned into the appearance of a bronze mirror. Then, it turned into all kinds of strange images or animals according to his will. Furniture, weapons, and so on. Magic treasures, plants, and so on. Almost everything in the world appeared in his hands. Everything that appeared in the innate inextinguishable spiritual light was vivid and lifelike. There seemed to be no change from reality. It was completely the real thing. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you've been peeping for so long. Are you still not willing to come out and meet me?" His words. They gently drifted into the world of the fake sacred civilization, into the supreme palace, and echoed in the ears of the World Emperor. Hearing this, there was a faint imprint in the World Emperor's heart, but it soon collapsed and disappeared. It was similar to the reaction of Gui Shou and the others when they heard Luo Fan's words. This was also the first time the World Emperor heard Luo Fan's voice after he came out of seclusion. Before this, although he was peeping from afar, but for some reason, he could not hear anything Luo Fan said at all. Even what he saw was a blur. He could only vaguely see an outline. Even the voice has become completely incomprehensible? The World Emperor frowned and thought to himself. With this thought, he sighed, got up, and stepped across the layers of space and time, directly arriving in front of Luo Fan. When he arrived, he saw the various lights and shadows that were constantly changing in Luo Fan's hands. For a moment, he could not help but be slightly stunned. At this stage, why is he still in the mood to play with this? Creating these things out of thin air is very simple even for connate grand Luo cultivators. For someone at his level, he only needs a thought to be able to create trillions of them. Why is he still interested in playing with this at this time? Or is there some secret hidden in it? However, very soon, he had already discovered what was constantly changing in Luo Fan's hands through the aura that was emitted from the various changing things. When he discovered this, his heart suddenly became incomparably shocked. This is the connate inextinguishable spiritual light?" he exclaimed, his eyes filled with shock and disbelief. Luo Fan smiled and said, "It is indeed the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Could it be that you have already become a sage?" The World Emperor suddenly felt his heart beating faster. The sage he was talking about was naturally not becoming a false sage, but becoming a true sage. This point did not even need to be explained to be known. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "Become a sage? How can it be so simple? Right now I only have some understanding, so my ability to control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light has improved. How can you control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to such a degree without becoming a sage?" The World Emperor was extremely shocked. This is only the form on the surface, and its internal form is still the same. It is actually not difficult to control it to such a degree. With your strength, you can also do it easily if you go one step further. Luo Fan just smiled. As he spoke, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had already turned back into a halo in his hand and drilled into the back of his head. It directly returned to the back of his head and hung there again, looking no different from before. Hearing what Luo Fan said and seeing him play with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light like playing with mud, the World Emperor couldn't help but smile bitterly. Perhaps it is easy for you to go one step further, but for me, if it wasn't for this catastrophe, I don't know how many billions of years I haven't felt the slightest bit of progress. It's just a matter of time. Luo Fan just smiled. At this moment, he no longer had any understanding of anything above the true sage level in his heart. What true divine magical powers! What true divine mysteries! What true divine marks! What true divine images! What true divine bodies! What primordial origin spiritual treasures! What congenital inextinguishable spirit light! Everything had been completely erased from his mind. It could be said that at this moment, he had almost completely abandoned all the gains and comprehensions he had gained after entering this world and even after entering the myriad heavens and realms. This kind of change should have greatly reduced his strength and greatly damaged his divine ability. But in fact, after abandoning all of this, it was as if he had given up all the burdens on his mind, and he felt unprecedentedly relaxed. Because of this, his mind became unprecedentedly clear. During this process, his view of the world gradually began to show various inconsistencies with his temperament. Many inexplicable omissions gradually began to surface. After these inconsistencies and omissions appeared, they did not cause him any trouble. It didn't cause him any trouble at all. He didn't even need to think about it, and he didn't need to study it. His mind naturally changed that worldview and naturally made up for these inconsistencies and omissions. It was precisely because of this, at this moment, that worldview could truly fuse with him, and there was no longer any gap between them. At this moment, the internal structure of his body was no longer the same as that of any other living being. It was completely composed of laws. That law was intertwined and changed in all kinds of extremely mysterious and complicated ways. They influenced each other and eventually formed his current body. It could be said that at this moment, he had completely become the manifestation of the worldview, just like his life source. And because of his changes, the relationship between him and the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had also become unprecedentedly strange. The two seemed to be extremely repelling and extremely attracted at the same time. This was because his comprehension of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had been completely destroyed, and it had completely disappeared. Therefore, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light completely repelled him, and it didn't even get close to him. It seemed like it could erupt with a terrifying power at any time to attack him. However, because of some extremely subtle mechanism, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was extremely welcoming to him, as if it wanted to fuse with him at all times, and it wanted to accept everything about him at all times. It was precisely because of this strange relationship that Luo Fan was able to manipulate the connate inextinguishable spiritual light as he pleased. As for the power of the divine abilities, although the current Luo Fan had already destroyed all the power and comprehension of things related to the true sage level, he could still use all the power of the divine abilities. However, the foundation of all the power of the divine abilities had been changed, and it was based on the world-view of laws. Because of this change in foundation, it also made his control of the power of the various divine abilities more and more superb, and the effects they could bring out. It was unknown how many times stronger he was before. In the past, if he wanted to deal with the World Emperor in front of him, he might need to spend a lot of effort and planning for a long time. In the end, it might even take him tens of millions of years to subdue him. But now, he could easily deal with him at any time. There was no other reason for this. It was because he had clearly seen the connection between the World Emperor and the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, and he had also seen the incompatibility between the power of the World Emperor's divine abilities and himself. Knowing these weaknesses, he could easily disintegrate the World Emperor's attacks and defenses with an extremely small amount of power. In the end, he could easily subdue the world emperor without even having the chance to enter the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Perhaps it would be extremely difficult to kill him in the end, but it would be extremely easy to make him unable to resurrect for hundreds of millions of years. I have already calculated that the next great tribulation of the world will come in 900 million years. Just as the world emperor was secretly lamenting about how powerful Luo Fan was, Luo Fan's words instantly made his expression change. He yelled, "How is this possible? There are only 1 billion years between the two great tribulations." At this time, he was no longer as calm as before. All he felt was fear and helplessness. As for why he didn't feel anything at all, and why Luo Fan could so easily calculate the specific time of the Great Tribulation of the world, he wasn't surprised at all. He couldn't be more clear about what kind of huge improvement there would be when one's strength increased by 1 level. What's more, at this moment, Luo Fan didn't just increase his strength by 1 level, but to a realm that he couldn't understand at all. It was obviously possible what kind of divine abilities and what kind of power would be derived from such an improvement. Being able to calculate the great tribulation of the world that would come in 900 million years was certainly not something to be surprised about. Chapter 1755. 900 million years. The Realm King could only smile bitterly. He had been blinded by the name of the Great Tribulation of the world, and did not react in time. The Great Tribulation of the world was not a tribulation that would descend at a fixed time. Instead, it was like the tribulation of cultivators. It would descend according to the development of the world. According to the development of the world, it would definitely develop to an unimaginable level after 900 million years. By then, it would naturally trigger the second Great Tribulation of the world. That would be normal. Looks like I have to make preparations early. The Realm King's expression became serious after smiling bitterly. It's an excellent preparation for you to establish the fake sage civilization. If the fake sage civilization is developed, the chances of this world surviving the Great Tribulation of the world will be greatly increased, Luo Fan said with a smile. The Realm King's eyes lit up slightly. The weight of the current Luo Fan was obviously completely different from before. Any kind of praise would be an honor to the Realm King, but it was no longer the humiliation he felt in the past. He immediately said, "Do you think this fake sage civilization has a future? In fact, I didn't establish this fake sage civilization. I only contributed a little. The real source of its appearance is actually natural development." Luo Fan smiled faintly. Of course it has a great future. The more prosperous the fake sage civilization is, the more prosperous the cultivation civilization will be. In the end, if there's enough time, the fake sage civilization will definitely become the main body of this world. By then, this world will truly transform. All great tribulations of the world will not be a problem for such a world. It won't be a problem. These words, however, were spoken in a rather firm manner. After all, compared to any living creature in this world, Luo Fan had a huge difference from them. That was, he had personally witnessed the great heaven and earth that had gone through 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth. From then on, there would be no more tribulations. In his eyes, even the world could not form the fake sage civilization like this, let alone make the fake sage civilization the main body of the world. Even the world could not do it. One could imagine how great the potential of the fake holy civilization was. It could be predicted that if the world really developed to that level, even the great tribulations of the heavens and earth that were countless times stronger than the other worlds would definitely be helpless against it. It could only watch as the world passed through the great tribulations of the heavens and earth, and in the end become a great world. However, it was obvious that there was enough time to do so. It made this situation almost impossible. The fake saint civilization used the fake saint as the smallest unit. Well, obviously, The growth speed of this civilization, and the time it took for it to change, was naturally determined by the state of the false saint. On the other hand, false saints were boundless and immeasurable. They were eternal existences in this world. It would take a very long time for them to be replaced. Billions of years were probably just a very short period of time. Under such circumstances, he had to wait until the fake sage civilization developed to a sufficient level and truly became the main civilization of this world. Even billions of trillion years wouldn't be able to accurately describe the time required for this. The Realm King was well aware of this. However, although he was well aware, he was already quite happy and satisfied. Whether the time needed was long or short was one thing, but whether it had the potential to develop to that level was another. Since this fake sage civilization had such potential, it meant that his efforts were fruitful. He had the chance to lead this world to that supreme level. How could he not be happy? Since you think so highly of this fake sage civilization, why don't you become the ruler of this civilization? The Realm King smiled. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said, "There's no need. You're so good at being the ruler. If I go, I'm afraid I'll ruin this fake sage civilization." Hearing this, the Realm King could only sigh. He naturally didn't believe what Luo Fan said about being afraid that he would ruin this fake sage civilization. However, he could also tell that Luo Fan wasn't interested in being the ruler of this fake sage civilization at all. At that moment, he didn't try to persuade him. He just asked Luo Fan to go to the fake sage civilization to take a look and see the development of this civilization with his own eyes. He wanted to see if there were any improvements that needed to be made. Regarding this, Luo Fan just smiled and agreed. Now, he didn't need to comprehend the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, nor did he need to comprehend the mysteries of the chaotic state. All he needed was to continuously communicate with his worldview of laws, and let his worldview of laws come into contact with all kinds of mysteries and mysteries. Naturally, he could do whatever he wanted and go wherever he wanted. Entering the space-time of the fake sage civilization to walk around and observe was also part of his plan. Since Luo Fan had agreed, they naturally wouldn't stay there any longer. The two of them took a step forward and instantly crossed space-time, entering the space-time that was extremely far away for ordinary cultivators. As they left, the cultivators who were watching at the side recovered from their daze. Previously, the Realm King and Luo Fan had been talking for a long time, but to them, they could only see two light shadows slowly changing. They couldn't see the specific image or hear what the two of them were talking about at all. It wasn't until this moment that the two of them left and entered the space-time that they could only vaguely sense but couldn't really see clearly that they completely recovered. It was also then that they truly recognized what the spiritual mountain surpassing boundary had become after the changes that completely exceeded their perception. How did this place become like this? A 9th-rank pseudo-sage cultivator exclaimed. In front of them was the Mount Numinous that they had lived for millions and tens of millions of years. At this moment, it was even more profound and mysterious than before. However, everything looked completely different. The mountain peak, the forest, the vitality, and all kinds of scenery that were originally extremely familiar. Now, he had completely changed into a different appearance. If they didn't know that this was the spiritual mountain surpassing boundary, they would also be able to see the familiar scenery around the spiritual mountain surpassing boundary. They might even think that they had unknowingly arrived at a completely different place and witnessed a completely different Mount-spirited scenic spot from before. It seems that there are more profound secrets hidden here than we imagined. Another 9th-rank pseudo-sage said. What should we do next? Continue to build a mountain gate here? Another 9th-rank pseudo-sage said. Of course. The 9th-rank pseudo-sage who spoke first said. He said this without the slightest hesitation and was resolute. Hearing this, the other 9th-rank pseudo-sage's expressions changed slightly. They were very clear that although all the changes that happened previously were beyond their perception, they couldn't even see what exactly happened. However, even if they looked at it purely with logical reasoning, they could clearly tell that there must be a pseudosage or even an extremely high-level pseudosage doing something here. Although it was very likely that those things had been completed. However, there was also a high possibility that those things were just the beginning. Under such circumstances, if they were to build a mountain gate here and continue to open a cave abode here, if they were to build a sect here, wouldn't they have to worry that those high-level pseudosages would be dissatisfied and attack them because they were here? One had to know. Even if it wasn't a high-level pseudosage, as long as a level 1 pseudosage made a move, the many 9th-rank pseudosages would be completely crushed without any ability to resist. Everything would disappear completely. Don't you know what this means and how much danger you have to take? A 9th-rank pseudosage female said with a frown. Hearing this, the 9th-rank pseudosage said indifferently without hesitation, "Of course I know that this requires a lot of danger. However, don't you know what kind of opportunity this is?" Opportunity? These words made the eyes of the other pseudosages light up. Just now, they were shocked by the terrifying methods of Luo Fan and the Realm Emperor, but they didn't think about it from the perspective of opportunity. At this moment, when the 9th-rank pseudosage mentioned this point, their thoughts suddenly opened up, and all kinds of thoughts that were previously hidden came out. At this moment, they appeared out of thin air. At this moment, the 9th-rank pseudosage spoke again. As long as we obtain a little bit of the power left behind by those pseudosages and comprehend it, we will be able to break through, become a pseudosage, and ascend. Isn't it worth taking that little bit of risk for this kind of opportunity to ascend? In the past 100 million years of development, with the establishment of the pseudosage spacetime, every time a cultivator became a pseudosage, they would naturally step into the pseudosage spacetime. After that, there were very few pseudosages that appeared in front of people again. Instead, they all lived in the pseudosage spacetime. Therefore, unknowingly, becoming a pseudosage gradually gained the meaning of ascension in the eyes of many cultivators. And to them, the spacetime of the pseudosage spacetime was a higher level, similar to the immortal world in the eyes of mortals. It was precisely because of this that the 9th-rank pseudosage would say such words at this moment. When he heard the words of the rank 9 pseudo-saint, the other pseudo-saints could no longer conceal the excitement on their faces. Although there were already more than 1 billion false saints in this world, it did not mean that it was easy for cultivators to become false saints. In fact, the reason why there were so many false sages was because there were too many living beings in this world, and this world was too high level. The difficulty of becoming a false sage was not much different from other spacetimes. Normally, out of millions of pseudosages, 1 or 2 of them would be able to become pseudosages. That was already considered a very high probability. The quality of those pseudosages was considered excellent. It was almost impossible for a normal false saint to become a false saint. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the price that any pseudosage was willing to pay and the danger that they were willing to take in order to break through to the pseudosage stage. At this moment, he heard that there was actually an opportunity to become a false sage here. These pseudosage sages completely forgot about the dangers they would encounter here. At most, I'll just die. In order to become a false sage, I'll die. What's the big deal about taking this little risk? This was what everyone was thinking at this moment. With just a few mental exchanges, they had already made a decision and agreed to set up the mountain gate here again. At this moment, there were already more and more lights coming towards this location. Each of the glows represented 1 or more pseudo-sacred realm cultivators. There were already more than 1 billion pseudosages in this world. According to the fact that only 1 or 2 pseudosages would appear out of millions of pseudosages, one could imagine the number of pseudosages in this world. Although this location was not considered too special in this vast and boundless world. However, There were also a large number of pseudo-sages densely packed in the surroundings. These pseudo-sages were scattered within a radius of hundreds or thousands of light-years. Previously, the various changes that happened in this location were naturally sensed by them. Their logical reasoning ability was not inferior to any of the pseudo-sages here, so they naturally knew what everything that happened here meant. Of course, they could also imagine what kind of opportunity and danger this place represented. It was obvious that they would rush here. Seeing the lights coming from all directions, the pseudo-sages here all knew that things were not going well. Many of the rank 9 pseudo-sages here knew that the situation was not good. Without any hesitation, they rushed towards the spirited mountain surpassing domain and quickly chose the best position. In other words, they chose the position closest to where Luo Fan and the World Emperor were. When they chose the location of the mountain gate, tens of thousands of pseudo-sages had already arrived at the spiritual mountain surpassing realm. They had already thought about it and began to settle down in the spiritual mountain surpassing realm one by one. They wanted to open up a cave abode. Although the spiritual mountain surpassing realm had been upgraded time and time again, the current cultivation environment had already reached the point where it was almost the best in this world. However, it was only a corner of the world after all, so the space inside was naturally limited. The places that could be used to open up a cave abode were naturally even more limited. The pseudo-sages from before could still find a place to open up a cave abode here, but it was naturally difficult for those who came later. As they couldn't find a place to open up a cave abode, battles naturally occurred. Fortunately, they knew that the environment here was extremely important. If they destroyed it, it would incur the wrath of the public and make everyone look at them with hostility. Therefore, they had some scruples when they attacked and didn't go all out. That was why their battle didn't completely destroy the spiritual mountain surpassing realm. Although the pseudo-sages who set up the mountain gate at the beginning were united and numerous, the positions they occupied were simply too wonderful. In the end, they suffered the greatest attack. They barely held on for a few days before they were driven out of their positions and occupied by more powerful pseudo-sages. For the next few years, the spiritual mountain surpassing realm was filled with such battles. As the battles went on, the strong and the weak were gradually distinguished. In the end, after a few years, the entire spiritual mountain surpassing realm finally stabilized. The strongest pseudo-sages occupied the best positions, while the second strongest occupied the other positions. As for the weaker ones, they could only watch from the side. Among them, the pseudo-sages who had established their own sect in the spiritual mountain surpassing realm occupied the second strongest position. They barely occupied a position in the spiritual mountain surpassing realm to cultivate. Of course, he could only occupy a spot. It was clearly impossible for him to establish his own sect like he did in the past. Because of this battle, the reputation of this location gradually spread. This place had unknowingly become the gate to heaven. Legend has it that anyone who came here would have a chance to comprehend the method to become a pseudo-sage and fly away. Because of this reputation, more and more pseudo-sages came from all over the world to this location. This caused the surrounding area to become the place where many pseudo-sages chose to open up their cave abodes, causing this place to become more and more lively. Of course, no matter how strong the pseudo-sages were, as long as they weren't strong enough to suppress the tens of thousands of pseudo-sages occupying the spiritual mountain surpassing realm, they could only open up their cave abodes at the side and couldn't get involved. There was no other reason than that the pseudo-sages who occupied the spiritual mountain surpassing realm were extremely united. In order to ensure the interests of all of them, they had formed an alliance. Any foreign cultivator who wanted to seize a cave abode would have to encounter all of them and suffer the attacks of all of them. It was precisely because of this unity. Because of this, all of them were able to keep their positions and their cave abodes. This situation continued. 100 years later. Finally, a stage 9 pseudo-sage suddenly had an epiphany in this spiritual mountain. He broke through his limit and surpassed the Stage 9 pseudo-sage to become a Level 1 pseudo-sage. He ascended and entered the space-time of the pseudo-sage civilization. This finally caused the situation of this spirited mountain to undergo an earth-shattering change. In the past, although those rank 9 pseudo-sages knew that it was very likely that this place contained the secret to becoming a pseudo-sage, it was just a rumor after all. No one dared to confirm that the secret was really contained here. As expected, it really existed within. Therefore, even though he desperately wanted to enter the spiritual mountain surpassing realm and open up his cave abode, he still had some rationality. During the battle, if he felt that the price he had to pay was too great, he would naturally give up. But at this moment, the truth was already in front of him. There was really someone who could comprehend the secret of becoming a false sage here and surpass the limit. To them, becoming a false sage and ascending into the immortal realm was nothing. It was like a drop of water falling directly into boiling oil. In an instant, the rationality of the many rank 9 pseudo-sages exploded. Especially when the cave abode left behind by the ascended pseudo-sage was still empty. At that moment, the surrounding pseudo-sages who did not occupy a position also began to form alliances one after another and began to attack the alliance of the many rank 9 pseudo-sages in the spirited mountain surpassing realm. A war that was thousands of times more tragic than before broke out. In several alliances, each alliance had at least tens of thousands of rank 9 pseudo-sages. The power that they unleashed when they joined forces was terrifying enough to shake heaven and earth. Don't underestimate them. The rank 9 pseudo-sages seemed to be extremely weak. Any pseudo-sage could easily destroy tens of thousands of them, and they felt that they were really weak. In fact, any rank 9 pseudo-sage could easily destroy millions of major chiliocosms in an instant. It went without saying how terrifying the power that tens of thousands of such existences could unleash when they joined forces was. Compared to the past, the focus of these rank 9 pseudo-sages was no longer where Luo Fan and the World Emperor were standing, but the cave abode of the rank 9 pseudo-sage, who had ascended. It was not only because that cave abode had nurtured a pseudo-sage, and they felt that that location might contain the secret to becoming a pseudo-sage. It was also because the aura and power of that pseudo-sage were left there. If they occupied that cave abode, they could even sense the entire process of the rank 9 pseudo-sage breaking through to become a pseudo-sage. To them, who were stuck at this step, the benefits were so great that it surpassed everything. Under such circumstances, how could they not pay attention to this cave abode? At that moment, this space-time turned dark and the sun and moon lost their light. Fortunately, they still remembered what the main body they were fighting for was. Although the battle was extremely tragic, in the end, they still divided their strength to protect this spirited mountain-surpassing realm. Although the spirited mountain-surpassing realm was swaying under the countless attacks, it was still not destroyed in the end. There were wins and losses in the battles between the various alliances. The alliance that originally occupied the spirited mountain-surpassing realm would sometimes be chased away, and sometimes they would retake their cave abode. The art of war displayed in the ups and downs was enough for any living being who was interested in war to learn from it to become a god of war. This kind of battle lasted for 1,000 years. On this day, during their battle, another rank 9 pseudo-sage suddenly seemed to have comprehended something during the battle. He suddenly emitted an aura of a breakthrough and broke through the barrier between rank 9 pseudo-sage and pseudo-sage, brazenly stepping into the pseudo-sage level. At that moment, the entire battlefield fell into silence. Only the various phenomena that appeared due to the living beings becoming pseudo-sages in the world continued to appear and evolve. That cultivator was an extremely boorish man. At that moment, he had a domineering demeanor, and his entire body was filled with a kind of transcendence. He looked at the many rank 9 pseudo-sages who were filled with anticipation and said, "The secret to becoming a pseudo-sage exists." Chapter 1756. The fake saints' shout instantly heated up the scene by 100 times. All the level 9 pseudo-saints, who were originally rational, instantly lost their minds. The scale of the battle between them expanded by 100 times as a result. The many pseudo-saints had been here for a long time, but they had unknowingly attracted more and more cultivators to settle in the surroundings. To these level 9 pseudo-saints, becoming a pseudo-saint was their ultimate goal. However, to other cultivators who had yet to become level 9 pseudo-saints, these level 9 pseudo-saints were their goals. Previously, the many level 9 pseudo-saints still had some motivation. The scale of the battle did not expand endlessly, and the many living beings who had settled in the surroundings were not affected much. However, as the scale expanded, the cultivators who were originally not qualified to be involved were instantly involved. It was unknown how many cultivators had been completely wiped out in their battles. No one knew how much of the terrain around the spirited mountain had been completely changed. Even time and space were faintly trembling, causing all sorts of tribulations to descend from time to time. This war seemed to be the fuse of a small calamity in the world. As more and more cultivators were involved, the scale of their battle began to increase. More and more living beings were drawn into the battle. The cultivations of the creatures that were sucked in also began to fall lower and lower. The level 9 pseudo-saints, level 8 pseudo-saints, level 7 pseudo-saints, and even peak-stage quasi-saints and phenomenal quasi-saints. The range of involvement also continued to expand. At first, it was only within a few light-years around the spiritual mountain. As time passed, the range became larger and larger. 100 light-years, 1,000 light-years, 10,000 light-years, billions of light-years. In just a short 100 years, the scale of the war had already occupied 1/10 of the world. The vastness. It was even wider than any spacetime that Luo Fan had seen in the past, including the primordial world and the Earth universe. The number of living beings involved had reached a level that almost exceeded the limits of what numbers could describe. Fortunately, the root of their battle was the secret of becoming a pseudo-saint. Therefore, although the scale of the war was getting larger and larger, no pseudo-saints were involved. The strongest person in the war. However, it was only limited to the pseudo-saint stage 9. If that wasn't the case, the scale of the war wouldn't need to be so large. Just 1% would be enough to change the situation of the entire world, and it would be enough to completely destroy the development of the past 100 million years. The minor tribulation of heaven and earth, that was triggered in this corner of the world, was seen by all the false saints in the spacetime of the false saint civilization. The world emperor and Luo Fan, who were in the supreme palace, saw it clearly. I didn't think that the trace you left behind would trigger a war of this scale. On this day, the world emperor sighed. He said to Luo Fan. Luo Fan had not left the supreme palace after entering the spacetime of the fake saint civilization for so many years. Instead, he watched the changes in the spacetime of the entire fake saint civilization with the world emperor, as well as the various developments in the vast world below. During this process, they often exchanged their thoughts. It could be considered a different kind of Tao discussion. This was also the first time that Luo Fan and the World Emperor had truly discussed the Tao in depth, since they had known each other for so many years. Hearing the World Emperor's words, Luo Fan said calmly, "Although the trace I left behind was the fuse, what really caused this minor tribulation of heaven and earth to erupt was the countless karma accumulated over the past 100 million years. What truly caused this small calamity to erupt in this world is the countless karma that has accumulated over the past hundreds of millions of years." He did not think so much before and did not think about it from the aspect of karma. At this moment, with Luo Fan's reminder, he finally reacted and knew that the outbreak of this minor tribulation of heaven and earth was inevitable. Even without the traces left behind by Luo Fan, it would definitely erupt due to other reasons in the future. Even without the traces left by Luo Fan, it would inevitably erupt due to other reasons in the future. Although the great tribulation of heaven and earth encountered by any perfect world descended in a chaotic state, its strength still depended on the situation of the world. Any great tribulation of heaven and earth encountered by a perfect world, although it descended in a state of chaos, its strength ultimately depended on the situation of the world. Apart from the perfection and development of the world, the most important factor was the karma of the world. The karma of the world that triggered the great tribulation of heaven and earth was extremely chaotic. The karma of the world that triggered the great tribulation of heaven and earth would be extremely chaotic. The accumulated resentment and baleful aura from ancient times to the present would be too intense. Thus, the intensity of the great tribulation of heaven and earth would rise to an unimaginable level. If the karma was smooth and the accumulated resentment was not too much, the intensity of the great tribulation of heaven and earth would be reduced according to the situation. From this aspect, the outbreak of the minor tribulation of heaven and earth was a form of cleansing of the countless karma, resentment, and baleful aura that had accumulated over the past 100 million years. The war that broke out now looked tragic and the casualties were heavy. However, in reality, after this war, the operation of the world would be smoother, and the intensity of the second great tribulation of heaven and earth would also be reduced. Understanding this, the world emperor sighed again and said, "Fortunately, you're here. If you weren't here, I would have made a mistake." However, the world emperor had already decided to intervene in this minor tribulation of the world and prevent the war from continuing to expand and develop. Now that he thought about it clearly, he knew that if he did that, not only would it not be of any help to the power of the world, it would also increase the intensity of the great tribulation of heaven and earth 900 million years later. You just couldn't think of it just now. As long as you take action, you should be able to think of it very soon, Luo Fan said with a smile. However, this seems to be not enough to eliminate the karma. The world emperor frowned. This minor tribulation of heaven and earth only involved existences below the false sage stage. Although the scale of such a war was huge and terrifying, due to the difference in levels, it was impossible to clean up the karma, resentment, and baleful aura between the false sages. Even if this minor tribulation of heaven and earth passed, all the karma, resentment, and baleful aura in this world would not completely disappear. "Don't think too much, fellow Taoist," Luo Fan said calmly. He naturally knew what the world emperor meant. He clearly wanted to start an even bigger war and let those false sages participate in it. Minor tribulation, minor tribulation. Naturally, there was a limit to it. If all the false sages were to be drawn into this tribulation, the minor tribulation would become a major tribulation. At that time, there would be no need to wait for 900 million years. Soon, this world will fall into the second major tribulation of heaven and earth, he continued. These words caused the world emperor's body to tremble. Then, he smiled bitterly and said, "In front of you, all my thoughts seem so clumsy." "It's not that your thoughts have become clumsy, but that you've lost your composure," Luo Fan said. The world emperor could only smile bitterly and nod. He had to lose his composure. He had always been at the highest position in this world and had been at the peak for countless billions of years. This made him completely used to this position. He was used to this kind of peak. Under such circumstances, his position suddenly changed and he was no longer the strongest. Even if it was him, it was impossible for him to completely maintain his composure. Luo Fan also understood the world emperor's thought. At this moment, he did not say much and only carefully watched the development of the minor tribulation of heaven and earth. This was the first time he had seen such a minor tribulation of heaven and earth. To him, this was an extremely novel matter, and there were countless profundities contained within it. However, it also had countless inspirations for him. The reason why such a minor tribulation of heaven and earth would erupt in this world, and not in other worlds. The reason was actually very simple. It was because this world was simply too powerful. This minor tribulation of heaven and earth. In other worlds, it could actually be considered a great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, here, even the false saints did not need to make a move. The false saints could already completely solve it. Such a minor tribulation of heaven and earth lasted for 10,000 years. In the end, the scale affected more than half of the world and directly changed the situation of this half of the world. It caused the population of this world to decrease by nearly half and the number of false saints and quasi-saints to decrease by 70%. There were many other losses. There were countless of them. It could be said that if this was a normal world, this kind of loss was already enough to cause a world to completely fall. It had become an unsalvageable state, however. To this world, this kind of loss was nothing at all. In fact, because of this cleansing, the great Tao of this world became more and more active, causing the law layer within this world to become tighter and more powerful. That was a sign that the karma, resentment, and malevolent aura of the world had been deeply cleansed. Of course, this minor tribulation of heaven and earth was not without benefits. In fact, because of this war, there were tens of thousands of false saints in this world. These false saints had all broken through during that battle. Among them, a large number of them had broken through in the spirited mountain surpassing realm that Luo Fan had left back then, and this kind of breakthrough had also caused the spirited mountain surpassing realm to become the holy land of many rank 9 false saints, causing more and more false saints to be interested in that place. However, after 10,000 years of war, any of the pseudo-sage experts had already understood that it was impossible. Anyone who wanted to occupy that spirited mountain surpassing realm would be provoking all the other rank 9 false saints. That was an act that would inevitably lead to a terrifying war. Therefore, although there were more pseudo-saints interested in the spirited mountain surpassing boundary than before, they could only restrain themselves. Each of them occupied a certain area of the spirited mountain surpassing boundary for a period of time according to some rules formed during the war. In the end, there was even an organization that was specially established to arrange the time, order, and location for the many rank 9 false saints to enter the spirited mountain surpassing realm. That organization was formed by tens of millions of rank 9 false saints, but it had practically become the strongest organization in this world. An organization below the false saints. In fact, it was precisely because of the formation of this organization that the war that seemed to be spreading endlessly and eventually engulfing the entire world finally stopped. From this aspect, it could be said that this organization had saved this world. This organization was called Seeking Saints. The leader of this group was publicly acknowledged by the entire world. The strongest was a rank 9 false saint who was closest to the false saint. Moreover, it was a female rank 9 false saint. Her name was Chao Zun. She was a supreme venerable. She did not have no background. She was the disciple of a supreme emperor. As for that supreme emperor, he was a supreme emperor who obeyed the orders of the realm emperor. Therefore, at the end of the day, it was the world emperor who prevented the scale of this war from engulfing the entire world and the power of this minor tribulation of heaven and earth to stop at the level of a minor tribulation of heaven and earth. Fellow Taoist, you really have a good method. Luo Fan saw through everything and sighed to the world emperor. It's just that I had no other choice. The world emperor sighed. Fellow Taoist, you didn't let this minor tribulation of heaven and earth develop to its limit, but you left a tail. From now on, there will probably be a minor tribulation of heaven and earth every once in a while. Luo Fan shook his head. Hearing this, the world emperor frowned. Hearing this, the world emperor frowned. After a brief deduction, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. That's really the case. I didn't expect that I would make another mistake. Fellow Taoist, don't joke. How is that a mistake? This way, the world can eliminate karma, resentment, and murderous intent as much as possible. In the end, it will be able to welcome the minor tribulation of heaven and earth in its best state. Luo Fan smiled. The World Emperor smiled. I didn't expect this. Perhaps this is the result of my instincts. Luo Fan didn't dwell on this topic. At this moment, he smiled faintly and said, I've been here for too long. Next, it won't be good for me to stay any longer. The World Emperor heard this and sighed. Sadly, with you here all these years, I have learned a lot. These are all your own understandings. They don't have much to do with me. Luo Fan faintly smiled and left. Existences at their level rarely talked nonsense with each other. Naturally, they were straightforward and decisive. After leaving the Supreme Palace, Luo Fan lifted his foot and lightly stepped forward. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the Earth of the Underworld. In this Earth of the Underworld, the endless space-time was still the same. In that space-time, the turtle was still floating in the void like before. It was surrounded by countless treasures that condensed into a palace. Luo Fan didn't come here to disturb the turtle. That was why he did not stop at the turtle longevity. Instead, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. He arrived at the deepest part of the underworld, where the void within the void was, where the formless existed. There was no longer any space-time here. At a glance, everything was void. Even the turtle that shrouded the entire earth of the underworld seemed to be extremely far away at this moment, to the point where it was almost undetectable. This seems to be the junction between this world and Earth's universe. After sensing carefully, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. After having this thought, he sighed. It's a pity that after this world was perfected, its barrier has become extremely sturdy. Even if it's me, it'll be extremely difficult to break the barrier and leave this world. At this moment, he sensed a faintly discernible feeling coming from the deepest part of the void. It was the feeling of his main body. Although the feeling was very vague and faintly discernible, it wasn't as clear and obvious anywhere else apart from here. Therefore, it could be imagined that this place was definitely the connection between this world and Earth's universe. It was also the place where he first stepped into this world. With a slight thought, he slowly sat down cross-legged and sank into an indescribable state. As his mind sank into that state, the natural inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head began to slowly change. Like flowing water, it gradually surged into his hands and gradually turned into a ring between his hands. At this moment, with a thought, 8 rays of light shot out from within the natural inextinguishable spiritual light and charged into the depths of the void. Every single one of these 8 beams of light was a second-level Supreme Emperor. In other words, they were level 8 false sages. They were Emperor Ming and the others who had been refined by the natural inextinguishable spiritual light back then. If it was in the past, Luo Fan's ability to control the natural inextinguishable spiritual light wasn't enough, and he definitely wouldn't be able to let Emperor Ming and the others escape from the natural inextinguishable spiritual light unless he directly extracted the imprint of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light from their bodies. However, now that his ability to control the natural inextinguishable spiritual light had greatly increased, he could even split some of the power of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. He wanted Emperor Ming and the others to leave the natural inextinguishable spiritual light and work for him. That couldn't be any easier. At this moment, the 8 rays of light shot straight into the depths of the void and gradually dimmed, gradually becoming blurry. Finally, they completely disappeared without a trace. At this moment, this part of the world, or at least the underworld, began to tremble slightly. This kind of trembling was so weak and mysterious. In the trembling, all the time and space seemed to be pulled by some invisible force, as if it was about to leave its original spot. It was as if it was flying in a certain direction. This kind of change instantly aroused Gui Shou, who was cultivating in the palace formed by the treasure light. What's going on? It seems like the underworld has broken. Such a thought flashed through Gui Shou's mind. If it was in the past, he would definitely only be able to ask what was going on at the beginning and definitely wouldn't be able to make a judgment later. Only he could do this after obtaining Luo Fan's understanding of the true sage realm. All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. He sank his mind into the book of life and death and the judge's brush, using his own understanding of the true sage realm to activate these two pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. In an instant, all kinds of light and shadows flashed through his eyes, and he had already locked onto Luo Fan's location. So its master. Instantly, he came to a realization. Since he knew that Master had done all this, he was extremely relieved and directly threw everything to the back of his mind. He began to continue cultivating. Luo Fan's kindness was as heavy as a mountain. Without Luo Fan, he wouldn't be who he was today. Therefore, he would unconditionally support anything that Luo Fan did. Not to mention the fact that Luo Fan seemed to be cultivating in the deepest part of the underworld. Even if he wanted to destroy the underworld, he would directly send the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush to him. Luo Fan wasn't surprised that Gui Shou was able to discover him. Similarly, he didn't care that Gui Shou had discovered him. It was completely within his expectations. At this time, his mind was attached to Emperor Ming and the others, as they continued to enter the depths of the barrier of the heaven and earth. At this moment, Emperor Ming and the others were not in the void, but directly in front of a strange barrier. They continuously attacked the various kinds of indescribable lights, trying to break this barrier and enter somewhere behind it. This barrier was different from the barrier outside the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos. Here, there were many kinds of strange colors, and one could faintly see various kinds of light and shadows that couldn't be described with words. Although the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos existed outside the barrier of the heaven and earth, it didn't mean that there was such a gap in every part of the heaven and earth. There were two conditions for such a gap to exist. First, there must be a heaven and earth. Second, there must be a state of chaos. In other words, only when there was a heaven and earth here and the other side of the barrier was a state of chaos could such a gap be created. Therefore, it was obvious that this place that was connected to the Earth's universe only fulfilled the first condition. Of course, there was no such gap here. Under such circumstances, after breaking through this layer of barrier, he would no longer enter the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos, but directly enter the Earth's universe. This also meant that he had to first break through the barrier of the heaven and earth, and then break through the barrier of the Earth's universe. Only then would he be able to achieve his goal. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Under the control of Luo Fan, Emperor Ming and the others surged their power in the process of attacking the barrier and directly constructed a mysterious array with 8 nodes. This array communicated with the power contained in the bodies of the 8 of them. This caused the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light in the bodies of the 8 of them to circulate rapidly, releasing an indescribable power. This power was so mysterious that it faintly emitted an aura that could only be released by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It charged straight into the depths of the barrier. During this process, this power was like a drill that continuously eroded the barrier and penetrated deeper into the barrier. Chapter 1757. However, it was obvious that this had nothing to do with Luo Fan. To Luo Fan, Emperor Ming and the others were merely a part of the innate inextinguishable spiritual light. They could only be considered as tools. He naturally did not care about what they did. If that was not the case, he would not have asked them to break the barrier. The barrier was a barrier of time and space, a barrier of heaven and earth. There was no time or space here. Therefore, Emperor Ming and the others felt that they had already broken through this barrier for tens of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years. But in reality, in the outside world, in another direction, Luo Fan had only just blinked his eyes. A terrifying shockwave spread out from the formation formed by the 8 of them. It shook the entire underworld and spread out to the Dao Yang realm, causing more and more space-time in the Yang realm to vibrate and change. More and more cultivators, more and more experts, were attracted by the commotion. They unknowingly cast their gazes over from all over the world in this direction. Of course, only a level 3 emperor like the World Emperor could see through all the barriers and see what Emperor Ming and the others were doing. As for the others, even a level 2 emperor could only see that Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in the deepest part of the underworld. "What are you doing?" The World Emperor appeared in front of Luo Fan with an inexplicable worry in his heart. Luo Fan opened his eyes and said calmly, "I'm just looking for a way to leave this world." The World Emperor's eyes narrowed when he heard this. "Are you planning to leave this world?" At this moment, his heart was filled with fear. Luo Fan was stronger than him. He had already admitted this point. Under such circumstances, he had already regarded Luo Fan as the greatest support for this world to survive the Second World Calamity. He even had countless plans in his mind that revolved around Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, he suddenly heard Luo Fan say that he was going to leave this world and abandon everything in this world. The shock in his heart was self-evident. Luo Fan nodded and said, "I wasn't born and raised in this world, I came from another world. It's normal to want to leave this world." "No." The World Emperor instinctively shouted. Luo Fan frowned and said indifferently, "Could it be that fellow Taoist wants to stop me?" As soon as the Realm King said those words, he knew his tone was wrong. He quickly said, "Dao friend, you misunderstood. Dao friend's ability is far stronger than mine. How would I dare to stand in your way? However, if you leave, what will happen to this world? Now that fellow Taoist has become the strongest expert in this world, you ought to become the strongest force in this world to resist the tribulation of the heavens and the earth. If you leave, then this world will have no hope left." Fellow Taoist must be joking. Whether or not this world can survive the tribulation is decided by the world itself. It has nothing to do with me. I don't have me. It's all the same, Luo Fan said indifferently. Hearing this, the World Emperor became anxious and said, "Why do you say that, Dao friend? Whether or not this world can survive the tribulation of the heavens and the earth depends more on the world itself. But the power of all living beings in this world also plays a big role. For example, if it wasn't for Dao friend, this world wouldn't have survived the last tribulation." Luo Fan still shook his head and said, "Dao friend, you're exaggerating. Even if it wasn't for me, there would have been other Dao friends. I only intervened at that time because of the request of this world. It was the world's own resistance." His words were vague, but it made the World Emperor show a thoughtful look. The World Emperor's realm was only second to Luo Fan. In this world, he was also the supreme existence. His understanding of this world, his comprehension of this world, he had reached an unimaginable level. As Luo Fan spoke, he could naturally think of a lot of things. He could clearly understand the meaning of this sentence. At this moment, he instantly thought of the key points in Luo Fan's words from what Luo Fan had said. He vaguely understood that what Luo Fan said was true. Every living being in this world, even those level 3 martial emperors who had transcended the world and mastered the innate inextinguishable spirit light, were part of this world. Their resistance was also the world's resistance. They helped this world to survive the tribulation, which was also the world's own power to survive the tribulation of this world. Under such circumstances, the existence or absence of any supreme emperor would naturally not have much of an impact on the great tribulation of the world. For example, in the First World's tribulation, any action that Luo Fan did, anything that he thought of, any inspiration that he obtained, was actually because Luo Fan existed in this world, because his connection with this world was too close. If he did not exist here, this world would naturally allow others to do everything that he did and think of everything that he had thought of. As for this, Luo Fan could only see through it after he had truly comprehended all the mysteries related to the true divine, after using the sharp blade of wisdom to completely destroy all the principles and mysteries that he should not bear. His mind became incomparably clear, and everything that he saw became incomparably clear. Everything that had obscured his mind in the past, making him unable to see clearly and see through, was now clear at a glance. It even felt like it had become common sense. This kind of indistinct influence that was originally imposed by this world was something that he could not see through in the past. But at this time, he could see at a glance that the great Tao of this world was constantly emitting a certain existence. He could even see that even at this time, the panic and worry that the World King had for him to leave were also instilled into him by this world. In fact, it was precisely because this world's control over this world was so strong. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan was unwilling to stay in this world, and would rather return to the Earth's universe that did not seem to be as high as this world. Although he did not know the situation of the Earth's universe, at least, compared to now, the situation would not be any worse. The World King listened to Luo Fan's words. Countless thoughts flashed in his mind, and all kinds of inexplicable feelings constantly emerged. He faintly understood, but after thinking about it carefully, he could not understand it. At this time, one by one, the third-level emperors stepped out from their respective places of cultivation. One by one, they crossed space-time and came to the deepest part of the underworld where Luo Fan was. These third-level emperors all looked at Luo Fan with a very puzzled and worried look. One of the third-level emperors even said, "Fellow Taoist, are you really going to abandon everything in this world? This underworld, that civilized country, those 3 Taoist friends who call you master?" At this time, Gui Shou sensed the changes here, and he broke away from that kind of cultivation state. His figure flashed, and in the blink of an eye, he crossed space-time and directly appeared in the deepest part of the underworld. He appeared beside Luo Fan. "The underworld is under my control. Fellow Taoists, you came here without saying a word. Isn't it a bit too much?" After he appeared, he did not ask anything else. Sorry. Currently, the power of Gui Shou's divine ability was even comparable to that of a world king. How could the third-level emperors not give him face? He immediately apologized one by one. This apology made Gui Shou's expression slightly better. However, right after that, the words of a level 3 monarch realm expert caused his expression to change drastically. "However, we've come for the sake of persuading fellow Taoist Luo Huang to stay. If we don't come, Taoist Luo Huang will abandon everything in this world and enter another world." "How is that possible?" Gui Shou exclaimed. At this time, how could he care about the other third-level emperors? He immediately turned his head to look at Luo Fan. He desperately hoped to hear something different from what the third-level emperor said from Luo Fan's mouth. Unfortunately, Luo Fan just looked at him and said lightly, "That's right." He said indifferently, "That's right, I am indeed going to leave this world." "Why? Could it be that we have done something wrong and made Master unhappy?" Gui Shou cried out in alarm. His expression became extremely anxious. For him, Luo Fan was like a teacher and a father. Luo Fan was almost the support of his life and the pillar of his cultivation. For a long time, he was able to be so carefree and cultivate so freely because he had Luo Fan behind him. Because he knew that Luo Fan could help him deal with all the troubles he caused. Under such circumstances, he could not imagine what would happen if Luo Fan left this world and completely disappeared from his life. What kind of state would he become? "This is my cultivation," Luo Fan just said lightly. For cultivators, this reason was enough to explain everything, and it was enough to shut anyone's mouth. Hearing this, Gui Shou looked frightened. He wanted to beg and stop him, but he could not say anything. His master had his own cultivation, and he could not be more clear about this. Even if he was his servant, he could not ask him to completely disregard his own cultivation and give in to his own demands and ideas. Seeing that Gui Shou was stopped by Luo Fan's words, the other third-level emperors became even more anxious. Originally, they had great hopes for Gui Shou. They were looking forward to what Gui's show said to change Luo Fan's mind and become the power for this world to survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Fellow cultivator, you have obtained so many benefits from this world. Now, when this world needs your strength the most, you just ran away. Aren't you afraid of karma? A third-level emperor said bluntly. His words and attitude were just short of pointing at Luo Fan and calling him a traitor for running away. Luo Fan heard this and frowned slightly. He said lightly, I have obtained benefits from this world, and I have been used by this world for such a long time. I have also left enough benefits. I think I have now repaid the karma of this world. As he spoke, there was a faint aura gradually released from his body. This aura was so powerful and terrifying. After it appeared, it began to slowly oppress all the supreme emperors present. At this time, they clearly felt that the person in front of them was not a weakling that they could question at will, but an expert who could easily get rid of them. For a moment, everyone's expression changed slightly. Gui Shou sighed and said, Although I am very reluctant to see my master leave, I can only support him. If my master wants to leave, I can only support him. Fellow cultivators, if you want to stop him, then you will be my enemy. His words contained a superhuman determination, vividly showing his determination. At this time, the World King said, Fellow cultivators, calm down. Luo Fan looked at him indifferently, and his aura did not decrease. Seeing this, the World King sighed and said, If you want to leave, I can't stop you. However, seeing that you have grown up in this world, can you please leave some of your strength to help this world survive the great tribulation of heaven and earth? Luo Fan listened. He furrowed his brows slightly. He wanted to leave this world because it was necessary for his cultivation. Furthermore, the ability to control this world was simply too strong and too strange. However, none of this could change the fact that the world had done him a great favor. It could not be changed. It was indeed because of this world that he had grown from the false saint level to the current level 3 sovereign level. Because of such kindness, if he were to simply leave, it would be somewhat inexcusable. At that moment, he sighed. Since that's the case, I'll explain it for everyone. Explanation? Many of the third-grade martial monarchs' faces turned extremely ugly. They admitted that Luo Fan was stronger than them, and admitted that they could not compare to Luo Fan. However, they didn't think that the gap between them and Luo Fan was so big that it was enough for Luo Fan to speak to them. Now that they heard this, they instinctively thought that Luo Fan was looking down on them and deliberately insulted them because they had stopped him. Only the World Emperor seemed to be deep in thought at this moment. His eyes revealed a look of anticipation. Immediately, he said, This couldn't be any better. Fellow Taoist is 100 times stronger than us. If we can obtain fellow Taoist's guidance, the benefits to us will probably reach an unimaginable level. His words. In an instant, the expressions of the other third-grade martial monarchs changed slightly. The World Emperor's words didn't sound like sarcasm. Could it be that this Luo Emperor really had some special ability that was far stronger than all of them? So much so that he could even help them? Luo Fan didn't care about everyone's expressions. He was prepared to talk about it. However, it wasn't the key to his cultivation, which was that unique view of the world. What he was prepared to talk about was a technique that could erase one's memory. In this world, almost every supreme martial monarch who had experienced the first great tribulation of heaven and earth could clearly hear the loud rumble when the true saint spoke. And this loud rumble contained a great hidden danger. If it were to erupt at any time, it would naturally evolve into a cultivation technique that could pull living beings into the universe of negative emotions. At that time, it would naturally pull many living beings into the universe of negative emotions. If it were to erupt during the great tribulation of heaven and earth, the scene would be unsightly, perhaps the entire world would be destroyed in such an eruption, and the entire world would be completely destroyed in the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Although the many third-grade martial monarchs were extremely doubtful about what Luo Fan was going to say, because of the World Emperor's attitude, they ultimately decided to listen to what Luo Fan was going to say and whether it would be useful to them. If it was really useless, then they would decide how to go against Luo Fan. After making his decision, Luo Fan directly said to Gui Shou, "Go and inform all the supreme martial monarchs who had the energy to go through the last great tribulation of heaven and earth to come here." Hearing this, Gui Shou's heart skipped a beat. He knew that the content that Luo Fan was going to say was probably more important than he had imagined. He hurriedly responded, and his body emitted countless rays of light that penetrated the void and went straight to various places in the world. Some penetrated into the space-time of the fake sacred civilization, and some penetrated into the cave residences hidden between space-time to inform the supreme martial monarch. Currently, there were more than 1,000 supreme martial monarchs in this world. Although most of them had broken through and become supreme martial monarchs after the great tribulation of heaven and earth, however, every single one of them had already existed in this world when the first great calamity of the world descended. It was just that they were either in despair or they weren't even in despair back then. Therefore, Gui Shou had informed all the supreme emperors in this world at this moment. However, among them, not all the supreme martial monarchs took Gui Shou's notification seriously. In the end, they arrived at the deepest part of the underworld. However, only 90% of the supreme martial monarchs were there. However, there were still hundreds of supreme martial monarchs who were hiding in their cave residences for one reason or another. They were not willing to go anywhere else to their place of cultivation. Gui Shou could only sigh in response to them. In this world, apart from Qing Yi and Yu Ji, he was the only one who trusted Luo Fan the most. Now that Luo Fan had asked him to inform the supreme martial monarchs in such a grand manner, he naturally believed him. The content of what he was going to say must be extremely important. If the supreme martial monarchs did not come to listen, they would definitely regret it in the future. However, Gui Shou wasn't a saintly being. Since he had already informed them, if the supreme martial monarchs were not willing to come, it was their own business. If they were to regret it in the future, they would be the ones to regret it. Therefore, he did not try to persuade them. He only began to plan the deepest part of the underworld and created a large space-time. It accommodated many supreme martial monarchs. Although this space-time was extremely vast, with only time and space, compared to the absolute nothingness from before, it was already a world of difference. At least, it had already prevented the supreme martial monarchs from continuously consuming their own power in the process of existing here. Although the consumption was insignificant and would not even be sensed by them, it was still consumption after all. For the supreme martial monarchs, it was naturally a good thing to be able to reduce the consumption. Seeing that those who were about to come were already here, Luo Fan did not waste any more words. He immediately began to slowly explain the memory-severing method. This time, he spoke. There was no heavenly flowers falling from the sky or golden springs gushing out of the ground. There was only an extremely peaceful and normal scene. These words were completely ordinary and simple. The words spoken by the people in the secular world were just like that. Even the special power contained within that could continuously form a brand in the hearts of those who heard it had already completely disappeared at this time. When the supreme martial monarchs heard the content of what he said, all of them had indescribable doubts in their hearts. They were all supreme martial monarchs. Perhaps there was a difference in their realms and strength, but in essence, they must have crossed a certain boundary. When they heard the content of what Luo Fan said, they immediately knew what it involved. Severing memories? What method is that? For us, severing our own memories couldn't be more simple. Why would we need any special method? A supreme martial monarch raised an objection, but Luo Fan did not pay attention to him. He just continued to explain the memory-severing method. That supreme martial monarch's expression changed slightly when he was treated coldly like that. But in the end, he had cultivated his mind enough, and did not lose his composure or have any malicious thoughts. He just suppressed his doubts and paid more attention to the method that Luo Fan was talking about. As he listened, he gradually discovered the uniqueness of the method that Luo Fan was talking about. That memory-severing method was too profound, too complicated, and too mysterious. Compared to this memory-severing method, the method that he had researched to severing one's own memories was so crude that it could not be cleaned up. Why does one have to use such a complicated and profound method to severing one's memories? Can't we use a simple method? This doubt echoed in the hearts of the supreme martial monarchs. Luo Fan did not have any intention of explaining to the supreme martial monarch. He just kept explaining the memory-severing method. This method was so complicated that it took him a full 10 days and 10 nights to finish explaining it to them. Throughout the entire process, he didn't even add any annotations to the technique. He merely explained its content and how to use it. Moreover, the words he used were extremely simple. When he finished the last word, he instantly shut his mouth, completely ignoring the puzzled looks of the crowd. "What do you mean, my friend? Why are you talking about memory-severing methods?" another supreme martial monarch asked curiously. Chapter 1758. When everyone heard Luo Fan's words, they all had an inexplicable look on their faces. Some were confused, some were at a loss, some were deep in thought, and some were even slightly angry. It was obvious that they did not know what Luo Fan's intentions were. Only an existence like the Realm King would have an inexplicable feeling. He began to search through his own memories, looking for any hidden dangers that might exist. The memory-severing technique was so profound that the memories it targeted weren't the ordinary memories that existed in their hearts at all. Instead, they targeted the higher-level memories. To us, what is a higher level of memory? The Realm King pondered. Finally, his eyes narrowed and a thought flashed in his mind that made him tremble. True sage. Only true sages are memories of a higher level than ordinary memories. Thinking of this, all kinds of inspiration emerged in his mind. All kinds of inexplicable sounds that had always existed in his memories but had been ignored by him appeared in his mind. As a cultivator of the same generation as the primeval Lord of Heaven, the Realm King had seen almost every true sage. There were countless memories related to the true saint. Now that he thought about it, countless roars echoed in the depths of his memory. Countless indescribable imprints lingered in his mind. Vaguely, he felt as if he had fallen into a boundless and terrifying fluctuation. His entire mind was like a leaf in a storm, drifting chaotically in the midst of the fluctuation. In the face of these countless memories, an inexplicable hesitation appeared in the Realm King's heart. What the Luo Emperor is referring to must be the memories of true sages. Moreover, he is targeting everyone, not just me. In other words, it is not that there is a problem with all the memories related to true sages, but one of them appeared during the first tribulation of heaven and earth. The memories of true sages that are related to all the supreme emperors who have experienced the first tribulation of heaven and earth. As he thought of this, countless memories related to true sages were once again suppressed in the depths of his mind. In the end, all that was left was the sound of the two swords reverberating in his mind. Just as these two memories emerged in the depths of his mind, an indescribable feeling of danger came from one of the loud roars. This is the sound of the conversation between the two true sages. At this moment, the World King had already made a judgment in his heart, and his expression became extremely ugly because of this. In this situation, although he did not know what the two booms were talking about, based on his spiritual senses, there was definitely something wrong with one of the booms. At this moment, the roar began to generate all kinds of indescribable waves. Strands of characters, runes, and images began to flow out from the roar that brought him a sense of danger. At this moment, the memory-severing technique that Luo Fan had mentioned before suddenly came to life. It abruptly transformed into a sharp blade of wisdom and brazenly slashed at the words, runes, and images that were leaking out. In an instant, all of them were completely destroyed. At this instant, the rumbling sounds became even more intense and terrifying. Faintly, the rumbling in the World King's heart began to condense and change. It gradually turned into stone, but it was a faintly discernible body. This body had 3 arms. On each palm there were 6 fingers. However, its face and the specific appearance of its body were completely blurred and could not be seen at all. After this body was formed, it opened its mouth and spat out countless words. These words, compared to the words, runes, and images that were leaking out from the previous roars, were countless times more numerous and much faster. In just a blink of an eye, it had already filled his entire memory. It made his mind feel an indescribable danger, but he could not help but immerse himself in it. He could not help but immerse himself in those words, immersing himself in the inexplicable principles that were described within. It was an indescribable familiarity. At this moment, it gradually emerged in the World King's heart. The aura of those Taoist friends seemed to be similar to the aura of this cultivation technique. Such a thought instantly appeared in the World King's heart. With this thought, the World King's entire body trembled. Even the innate inextinguishable spiritual light couldn't stop them from disappearing, but at this time, it actually appeared on his body. In the process of him trying his best to stop himself from immersing himself in the cultivation technique, the memory-severing technique that Luo Fan had mentioned before evolved into thousands of sharp blades of wisdom, slashing into the cultivation technique and the indescribable figure formed by the rumbling. They continuously eliminated the cultivation technique and continuously created wounds on the figure's body. Such a change gave the World King a chance to catch his breath, allowing him to focus his mind and quickly pour it into the memory-severing technique. The power of the memory-severing technique began to rapidly increase, allowing the strength of the wisdom blades to rapidly increase. In this way, the speed of the memory-severing technique became faster and faster. In the end, it finally suppressed the speed created by the rumbling, causing the scale of the cultivation technique to become smaller and smaller. In the end, after an unknown amount of time, all the cultivation techniques finally disappeared. And at this time, all the wisdom blades completely slashed into the figure formed by the rumbling, finally causing the wounds that appeared on the figure to become bigger and denser. Finally, at a certain moment, all the wisdom blades completely slashed into the figure and forcibly detonated. An earth-shattering thunderous sound came from the World King's body at this moment. In the deepest part of the underworld, the space-time created by the Guei Shou trembled violently at this moment. In the end, the space-time completely collapsed and everything turned into nothingness. However, it couldn't withstand the terrifying thunderous sound that came from the World King's body. This change alarmed the many supreme emperors here, causing them to be bewildered. They didn't know what exactly happened to the World King's body. Faintly, their gazes towards Luo Fan seemed to be filled with doubt. It was somewhat inexplicable. After that thunderous sound, the World King suddenly felt as if he had been freed from his shackles. His entire body floated there. An indescribable sense of ease and freedom lingered around his body, and his expression revealed an indescribable joy. At this moment, in his body, in his heart, the countless blades of wisdom had completely disappeared. Along with them, the rumbling that had transformed into a strange figure from before also disappeared. At the same time, although the World King had already remembered the memory-severing method, he no longer felt anything. He felt that it had become a more complicated memory-severing method. Originally, it was something that could be seen from time to time. The feeling that led him to explore it had completely disappeared. At this moment, the World King opened his eyes and bowed to Luo Fan. "Thank you for saving my life. If it weren't for you, the result would have been unpredictable when this hidden danger erupted. At this moment, the World King opened his eyes and bowed to Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "This is because of your own comprehension." Hearing their conversation, the Supreme Emperors were even more bewildered. All the Supreme Emperors were even more surprised and bewildered. There was clearly something they didn't know was hidden in there. However, they couldn't figure out what it was. For a moment, everyone's expression was filled with curiosity, and there was even a faint sense of inexplicable annoyance. "Don't keep us guessing. What exactly is the hidden danger? Can't you just tell us directly?" A level 3 sovereign said to the World King. His face was rough, and his expression was filled with anxiety and annoyance. The World King shook his head and said, "I want to say it, but I can't. Once I say it, things will be irreversible. You can only rely on yourselves to comprehend it." At this moment, he clearly understood why Luo Fan didn't explain this clearly before, and instead used such a confusing method to explain the memory-severing technique. There was no other reason. Because if he were to say it out loud, it would instantly ignite the words of the sage that existed in everyone's heart at this moment. At that time, all living beings who heard the sage's words would have the cultivation method to guide living beings into the universe of negative emotions. There was no time for them to activate the method to erase their memories. That cultivation method would allow them to step onto the right path of cultivation. At that time, all the hidden dangers would erupt, and in the end, most of the living beings in this world would disappear without a trace. How could Luo Fan say it directly when there was such a huge danger? So that's how it is. Many of the Supreme Sovereigns were in disbelief. They didn't doubt the World King's words. After all, if the World King could comprehend it himself, they would be able to comprehend it after some hard work. Once someone comprehended it, and the result was different from what the World King said, the World King wouldn't be able to continue living. Then what should we do? You can at least tell us, right? The level 3 sovereign said. Fellow Taoists, all you need to do is to comprehend the memory-severing technique. When the time is right, you will be able to comprehend it and understand it. The World King said. Hearing this, many of the Supreme Sovereigns fell into deep thought. At this moment, 3 claps of thunder suddenly reverberated in this void. Because there was no longer the barrier of time and space, the claps of thunder directly spread out. In the blink of an eye, they spread throughout the entire underworld, causing all the time and space in the underworld to reverberate with this clap of thunder. At this moment, many of the Supreme Sovereigns here had already identified what this clap of thunder was. It was the sound of some kind of shackle being broken. This clap of thunder spread throughout the underworld and instantly caused many living beings in the underworld to emit faint claps of thunder as well. It was as if they had broken some kind of indescribable shackle on their bodies. Many of the Supreme Sovereigns looked towards the source of the 3 claps of thunder. They discovered that it was the 3 Supreme Sovereigns beside Luo Fan. They were Gui Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji. At this moment, the 3 of them were surrounded by a kind of relaxed feeling similar to the World Emperors, a feeling of detachment from everything. It was obvious that they were just like the World King from before, using the technique of erasing memories. He had destroyed the words that he had heard from the true sage in his heart. "Thank you, Master, for your guidance." The 3 of them were extremely happy as they bowed to Luo Fan. Luo Fan only nodded lightly. At this moment, the void shook. A small octagonal door grew from small to large. It formed right in front of him. This octagonal door was blurry and emitted an aura of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. It seemed to be attracting and repelling everything at the same time. This is the door that leads to the outside world? Many of the Supreme Sovereigns' expressions changed slightly. "Master, let's leave with you." At this moment, Qing Yi and Yu Ji said impulsively. Hearing this, Luo Fan only shook his head and said, "This passage was created by me using the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. I used the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to open it. Only we can pass through. Once you enter, you will be completely crushed by that power and absorbed to maintain the passage. Therefore, you can't leave this world with me." Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji's expressions changed. There was an indescribable sadness in their eyes. At this moment, the other supreme sovereigns also had an indescribable look of pity on their faces. Their expressions were filled with indescribable helplessness. It was obvious that they had the same thoughts as Qing Yi and Yu Ji. Originally, they wanted to follow Luo Fan through the door and leave this world. Of course, Qing Yi and Yu Ji couldn't bear to leave Luo Fan. They wanted to follow Luo Fan. Therefore, they wanted to leave with him. However, this wasn't the case for them. They were all afraid of the calamity that would happen in 900 million years. They wanted to escape this world and enter a world that they had never been to before. "Fellow Taoists, please." Luo Fan smiled faintly at the supreme sovereigns. As he spoke, he lifted his foot and stepped into the octagonal passage. At this moment, Qing Yi, Yu Ji, and Gui Shou's eyes were filled with tears. In this part of the world, they were very worried when they suddenly couldn't contact Luo Fan at all last time. They had even given up on their own cultivation and tried to awaken him, even if it meant infuriating Luo Fan. They had managed to contact him. Now that Luo Fan had completely left this world and vanished from their senses, they might never be able to see him again. From then on, they would never be able to meet again. It was self-evident what kind of impact this was to them. Tears were obviously a matter of course. Seeing the three of them cry, the supreme sovereigns were both envious and jealous of Luo Fan. At the same time, they started to get curious. What exactly did it feel like to cry? After Luo Fan stepped into the passage, it slowly shrank and finally closed completely, disappearing without a trace. Following this change, Gui Shou and the other two finally lost all sense of Luo Fan. Their souls seemed to have lost all support at this moment. A feeling of emptiness and fluttering made their eyes fill with confusion. Their tears flowed even more fiercely. At this moment, the expression of one of the supreme sovereigns changed dramatically. An inexplicable aura was faintly emitting from his body. This aura carried traces of the aura of the universe of negative emotions. It was as if there was an inexplicable attraction force that was pulling him into the universe of negative emotions. Oh no! The realm sovereign knew at a glance that he had somehow triggered the rumble of the sage's words and caused the cultivation method that led living beings into the universe of negative emotions to appear. Following this change, the surrounding supreme sovereigns were all horrified. One by one, they distanced themselves from the supreme sovereign and watched the changes that were taking place on the body of the supreme sovereign with fearful and horrified expressions. At this moment, an invisible sharp blade suddenly appeared above the supreme sovereign's head and slashed into the void around his body, instantly extinguishing the aura. Following this, more and more sharp blades appeared and slashed into the void, continuously extinguishing the inexplicable aura that was constantly emerging, causing it to naturally disappear as soon as it appeared. At this moment, the expression of the supreme sovereign gradually calmed down from his initial panic. Although he was still a little solemn, at least he was no longer panicking. In a short while, all the sharp blades disappeared completely and the body of the supreme sovereign no longer emitted that inexplicable aura. After an unknown period of time, a thunderous sound came from the body of the supreme sovereign. This sound also spread throughout the entire underworld. Moreover, compared to the thunderous sound that had been produced by the bodies of Gui Shou and the others, this thunderous sound was even louder. The feeling of breaking through the shackles was even more intense. After this, the supreme sovereign felt an indescribable sense of relief. When he opened his eyes, his gaze was filled with joy and gratitude for Mo Min. "Fellow Taoist, what happened just now?" Another supreme sovereign hurriedly asked when he saw what happened. The supreme sovereign thought about it and sighed. I can't say. However, I still advise everyone to properly comprehend the memory-destroying technique. After saying that, he cupped his hands at the realm's sovereign. He took a step forward and disappeared into the void. He directly entered the space-time of the fake sacred civilization and returned to his own cultivation ground. Hearing what he said was similar to what the realm's sovereign had said, and seeing him leave so decisively, the various supreme sovereigns fell into deep thought as they recalled the various changes that had occurred to him. Some of the quick-thinking ones had even vaguely figured out the source of this. Perhaps, what fellow Taoist Luo Huang left behind is really an item that has saved our lives. That was the thought in his mind. This thought gradually surfaced in everyone's minds. At this moment, Gui Shou and the other two had also gradually come back to their senses. Their eyes were a little lonely as they turned around and left. However, they didn't even bid farewell to the others. Qing Yi and Yu Ji naturally returned to the place where their innate inextinguishable spirit light was located. After so many years of development, the two of them had now gained initial control of the innate inextinguishable spirit light. Although it wasn't to the level of control that other level 3 sovereigns had over the innate inextinguishable spirit light, they could already use it to protect themselves. In other words, within the range of the innate inextinguishable spirit light, even a level 3 sovereign would definitely not be able to defeat them and seize the innate inextinguishable spirit light. It was precisely because of this that they weren't worried that the location of the innate inextinguishable spirit light would be leaked to other supreme sovereigns. As for Gui Shou, he directly returned to the shroud of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush. He once again formed an indescribable fusion with the two pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. This fusion was also similar to the fusion with the innate inextinguishable spirit light. Moreover, because they were the two pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures that were born in this world, they were born with an extremely deep degree of fusion with him. Therefore, his ability to control these two pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures was many times stronger than the innate inextinguishable spiritual light that level 3 martial emperors could control. The power that he could display was only second to the world emperor. In this way, his ability to protect himself was obviously enough. Therefore, at this moment, when the many supreme sovereigns saw the three of them leaving, none of them said anything. Even the living beings who originally had a strong desire to seize the resources that the three of them controlled did not have any thoughts of challenging them at this moment. After the three of them left, the World Emperor didn't stay there either. He only emphasized that everyone should properly comprehend the method of erasing memories. Then, he turned around and left the nothingness in the depths of the underworld. He returned to the Supreme Palace in the fake holy civilization to comprehend the rewards he had obtained after eliminating the hidden danger. Perhaps I should also talk a few more times to pass down this memory-severing technique. Occasionally, such a thought flashed through the World Emperor's mind. Although the memory-severing technique was complicated, as long as one knew the principle and the goal, the World Emperor would be able to study it if he put in the effort. Therefore, if he wanted to talk about the memory-severing technique to achieve the same effect as what Luo Fan had said before, it wouldn't be difficult. With this thought in mind, he had already made his decision. However, this was a matter for the future. After all, if the living beings that were too weak knew about the memory-severing technique, it would be difficult for them to have enough strength to destroy the true divine's words. On the contrary, if the living beings that were too weak knew about this, they would only activate the words in advance, causing the hidden danger to erupt in advance. As the World Emperor left, the other supreme sovereigns also left the nothingness one by one and gradually returned to their cave residences. In the next tens of millions of years, there would be thunderous sounds that contained the charm of breaking the shackles from time to time, echoing endlessly between heaven and earth. Chapter 1759. Everything that was happening in that world was meaningless to Luo Fan. While all sorts of changes were taking place in that world, He had already left the perfect world through the octagonal passageway and headed towards Earth's universe. Even if the two perfect worlds were tightly connected, it would still be extremely difficult to cross them. Crossing the distance between them was like crossing an endless road in that passageway. Time was utterly meaningless. In Luo Fan's perception, he'd been flying in that incomparably strange and extremely long spatial passageway for an unknown number of millions of years before he finally felt the space before him turn empty. He'd broken through that invisible barrier and entered a perfect world that was completely different from the one he was in before. Is this the feeling of a perfect world that has undergone the seventh Great Tribulation? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind as he sensed the feeling that the world before him gave him. The octagonal passageway existed in an extremely mysterious state. Although it was supported by the Light Emperor and the other 7 Supreme Emperors, it still relied on the power of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Under such circumstances, the space-time passageway would naturally close up wherever he passed by. Therefore, the moment he left the passageway, the space-time passageway had already closed up around him, as if it had never existed. The Light Emperor and the other 7 Supreme Emperors had also completely returned to the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, as if they had never appeared in the first place. Luo Fan looked back and found that there was nothing behind him. There was nothing at all. Even the puppets of time and space did not exist. Around them, in the boundless nothingness, there was an endless void. It was filled with an indescribable aura. This kind of aura was so obscure, so illusory. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a third-grade emperor, he wouldn't have been able to sense it. If he hadn't been a third-grade emperor, he would have passed through a completely different world. He definitely wouldn't have sensed the existence of this aura. It was faintly discernible. Luo Fan could sense the traces left behind by the Great Tribulation in the extremely obscure aura. The layers of marks looked like rings upon rings of a tree. Through the number of marks, one could easily tell how many Great Tribulations this world had gone through. It's just as I guessed. This world is about to undergo the 8th Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. This world should have completely shattered after the 8th Great Tribulation of the world. In the end, it will enter a cycle of eras. He thought to himself with a grave expression. This situation was the future of this world. In the past, he had taken it for granted. However, from his point of view, it didn't make sense no matter how he looked at it. Would the existence of a true divine really allow things to develop according to his own understanding? Various thoughts flashed through his mind. In the end, he shook his head and shook all of these thoughts out of his mind. He thought to himself, these things are still too far away from me. All I can do now is cultivate as much as I can. I will try my best to perfect my worldview. If I can make a breakthrough in these 3 billion years and become a true divine, then I won't have to be afraid of anything. With this thought in his mind, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. His figure had already crossed the void and entered the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. He entered the world that he had opened up there, the world that he originally wanted to rely on to exist freely in the state of chaos. In an instant, it fused with his body. At this moment, the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head. It hung directly behind the head of his body. He had entered that perfect world for hundreds of millions of years, but because the space-time of the 2 perfect worlds was not synchronized. In fact, only tens of millions of years had passed in this universe. Due to the adjustments made by his main body, only a little more than 1,000 years had passed in this part of the space-time. Now, there was still a long time before the next Great Tribulation of heaven and earth. The relationship between the main body and the doppelganger was many times closer than the relationship between the main body and the doppelganger. There was no loss in the communication between the two, and there were no obstacles at all. The moment his main body and the doppelganger completely fused, all the gains of the doppelganger had completely become the main body's. his entire body began to emit the aura of the world of laws. This aura was even denser and more essential than the world he was in. After it appeared, it naturally affected the surrounding spacetime, causing the surrounding spacetime to show signs of the law transformation. Moreover, because this world was completely created by him according to the world of laws, the spread of the law transformation was many times faster than the other worlds, and the scale was also many times larger. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept across the entire world, causing the entire world to become extremely deep and profound. The various structures, combinations, and mysteries that were originally only compatible with the world he had entered, which was the false saint-level world of laws, began to gradually change at this time, becoming a new, deeper, more perfect and purer world of laws. It only took a moment for his main body and the doppelganger to fuse and communicate. However, for his world of laws to truly go deep into the entire world and completely change the essence of the entire world, it would take billions of times longer than the fusion between his main body and the doppelganger. When this change appeared, the Air Maiden, who was cultivating in this world, was the first to feel it. She immediately stopped her cultivation in shock. With a shift in the void, she went deep into the layers of laws and arrived at the place where Luo Fan had opened up his cave abode. She saw Luo Fan, who was floating in the grayish existence, and also saw the connate inextinguishable spiritual light in the form of a halo behind his head. Luo Fan, what's wrong? The Air Maiden looked at Luo Fan. There was an inexplicable worry in her eyes as she muttered. After all these years of cultivation, the Air Maiden's world of laws had now been perfected to the false saint level. Although his current cultivation level was only at the pseudo-sage level, he was comparable to any supreme emperor in the other world. She was even closer to a true saint. However, this level was still not enough for her to enter the grayish existence at this moment. Just like in the past, she had to rely on Luo Fan's guidance to enter. Now that Luo Fan had fallen into a state that was close to a deep sleep, he was completely unaware of the changes in the outside world. Naturally, she had no way of entering the grayish existence to meet Luo Fan. At this moment, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light behind Luo Fan's head was fluctuating slightly. The halo suddenly turned into a ball, then into various creatures, and then into various landscapes and terrains. Some of them were extremely familiar to the Air Maiden, while some were extremely unfamiliar to him. The Space Maiden was extremely curious about what it was when she saw all of this. The speed of the change was getting faster and the extent of the change was getting larger and larger. In the end, it even connected into one. It turned into a light and shadow, constantly twisting behind his head. Just when the Air Maiden thought that the change would last forever, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light suddenly condensed into a sharp blade. It violently slashed into Luo Fan's body. The Air Maiden couldn't help but scream at the sudden change. Although she hadn't seen clearly what the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was these days. However, she could sense the incomparably terrifying aura that was being transmitted from it. In his heart, he clearly knew that even if there were millions or billions of him, he would still be easily crushed and destroyed in the face of that constantly changing thing. Under such circumstances, it was so powerful. For such a terrifying thing to suddenly slash into Luo Fan's body, it was a terrible change in her eyes. One could imagine. How could she remain indifferent in the face of such a change? In the midst of the scream, she even couldn't help but charge towards Luo Fan, crashing straight into the dusky existence. The dusky existence was a chaotic state that simulated the state of chaos. This state was beyond what the Air Maiden could bear. The moment she crashed into it, the Air Maiden's body distorted indescribably, as if her entire body was about to be completely disintegrated by the dusky existence. At that moment, an indescribable fluctuation suddenly swept across her body, resisting the disintegration with great difficulty. This kind of fluctuation was completely incomparable to this part of the world. Moreover, it was also inharmonious with the Earth's universe. It was as if it came from another completely unfamiliar world, a world that was completely different from any world that Luo Fan knew. This was none other than the power of the Air Maiden's unique worldview. The power of this worldview wasn't pure. Compared to Luo Fan's worldview of laws, it was many times weaker. However, it was still in its embryonic form, so its power was much stronger than other means. At that moment, wherever the fluctuations swept past, the dusky chaos began to produce an indescribable order. However, this order couldn't last long, and it wasn't stable enough. After appearing for less than a moment, it completely collapsed and disappeared, as if it had never existed. Fortunately, the fluctuation of the worldview within the Air Maiden's body continuously seeped out, which allowed her to maintain her existence in the dusky world without being disintegrated. However, this was clearly only temporary. If the situation didn't change, she would eventually not be able to withstand it, and she would be completely disintegrated by the dusky existence. At this moment, the sharp blade that existed in Luo Fan's body suddenly rushed out of his body. In an instant, it crossed the grayish existence and brazenly slashed at the Air Maiden's location. In an instant, the terrified Air Maiden was drowned in it. At the last moment before she was drowned, a poignant but relieved smile appeared on the Air Maiden's beautiful face, as if she felt that this wasn't an unacceptable outcome. After the sharp blade drowned her, the Air Maiden had already disappeared without a trace. The sharp blade turned again and returned to where her body was, brazenly slashed into it, and continued to disappear. An unknown amount of time passed, just like that. It seemed like an instant, but it also seemed like hundreds of millions of years had passed. Finally, at a certain moment, an indescribable thunderous sound came from Luo Fan's body. This sound was so loud and shocking. Listening to this sound, it was as if all the shackles in his body had been broken, and there was an indescribable sense of relaxation in his body. With this thunderous sound, everything in the surroundings was completely shattered in an instant. This place returned to the nothingness under the layers of laws. The dusky existence couldn't withstand the shock of the thunderous sound, and it completely collapsed. It was as if it had never appeared. This thunderclap was like a switch triggering more and more thunderclaps, which were getting more and more intense. These sounds were no longer obstructed by the grayish existence. Instead, they continued to pass through layers and layers of laws and into the normal spacetime. They continued to spread to a wider and wider area, allowing the living beings in the spacetime to feel the power to break through their shackles and break free from the shackles imposed on them by the world or other existences. All sorts of principles that they couldn't comprehend due to certain restrictions kept appearing in their mind. The cultivation civilization of this world. Because of this change, they actually made great progress and started to improve. This thunderous sound seemed to be endless. It was constantly transmitted from Luo Fan's body and spread throughout the world. In the end, there was an unprecedented thunderous sound. The flow of time in the world actually started to accelerate. Only a few days had passed in the outside world, but tens of millions of years had passed here. The great tribulation that Luo Fan had suppressed for a long time suddenly began to descend. However, this great tribulation of the world was far inferior to the great tribulation of the world experienced by the other side of the perfect world. Luo Fan did not even need to make a move. Just by relying on the thunderous sounds that continued to come from Luo Fan's body, this was already enough to destroy the great tribulation, causing most of the world to be destroyed. Bathed in the white light of passing the great tribulation, it began to grow rapidly. After that, although the flow of time slowed down a lot compared to before, it was still extremely fast. Only a short 10,000 years had passed in the outside world, but the world had already passed for billions of years. During these billions of years, the world had passed through several great tribulations in succession. Although the strength of the great tribulation of the heavens and earth increased with each passing great tribulation, However, because the thunderous sounds kept ringing out, it constantly helped the cultivation civilization of the world to improve and help the world pass through the Great Tribulation. Therefore, every time there was a great tribulation of the heavens and earth would pass through it without any mishaps. When the thunderous sounds completely disappeared and Luo Fan gradually woke up in the deepest part of the layers of laws, the world was about to pass through the 8th Great Tribulation. This, compared to Luo Fan's initial speculation, was already several times stronger. It's finally done. I didn't expect that it would take such a long time to completely destroy all the comprehensions related to true divinity in my body. Luo Fan's heart flashed with such a thought, and he slowly opened his eyes. At a glance, the layers of laws of the world had already become 8 layers, just as he had planned. The entire world was filled with a faintly discernible and extremely obscure aura that contained traces of the 7 great tribulations of the world. Just from these 2 situations, one could already see how many great tribulations this world had passed when he had used the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to form a sharp blade of wisdom to destroy his original body's comprehension of true holiness. I didn't expect that I would unknowingly raise my limit to this level. Sensing the world in front of him, he had an inexplicable feeling on his face. With a thought, he opened his hand slightly, and a ball of light slowly flowed out from his palm, gradually condensing. This was his connate inextinguishable spiritual light. After the connate inextinguishable spiritual light appeared, he stepped into it and directly arrived in the void between the endless worlds within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Compared to before, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had not changed at all. It was as if all the indescribable changes that had happened before had never happened. After arriving here, the copper mirror that had evolved from a part of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light shook slightly. It had already appeared in front of him, and started to happily spin around him. It has spiritual intelligence? Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. The primordial spiritual treasure itself had spiritual intelligence. This was a matter of course. This kind of spiritual intelligence was completely different from the will of a living being. It was more similar to the will of heaven and earth. Its thinking circuit and way of thinking were completely incomprehensible to living beings. Normally, if a cultivator who was not a true sage wanted to control it, they could only control it in the same way as a magic treasure without spiritual intelligence. This was the method that Luo Fan had always used to control the copper mirror. But now, the copper mirror was obviously completely different from before. This kind of spiritual behavior clearly showed that its spiritual intelligence had already transformed into the spiritual intelligence of a living being. On a certain level, it was a kind of regression. However, for Luo Fan, it was a happy thing. He pointed his finger and the copper mirror in front of him shook slightly. It melted in midair and transformed into the figure of a 3-year-old boy in the blink of an eye. It started to climb up and down on Luo Fan's body happily. When Luo Fan saw this, he suddenly felt that he had done something unnecessary. He had originally thought that the spiritual intelligence of this copper mirror would at least be at the level of a teenager. He did not expect it to be at the level of a 3-year-old. However, since he had already done it, he could not be bothered to change it. He sighed and with a thought, he instantly found the Sky Maiden who was cultivating in a certain world in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. In a blink of an eye, his figure had already traversed an endless distance, crossed layers of time and space, and appeared directly in front of the Sky Maiden. The Sky Maiden was refining a magic treasure in the 9 heavens just now. When Luo Fan suddenly appeared here, her body trembled. There was an indescribable surprise in her eyes. "You're here." After all, she had an extremely calm personality. In the end, she only uttered this sentence calmly. "Yes, I'm here. It's been hard on you all these years." Luo Fan sighed and said with some shame, The Sky Maiden shook her head and said, "It's not hard on me. I'm just a little worried about you." Luo Fan sighed, opened his hand, and gently held the Air Maiden in his arms. This was not the first time he hugged the Sky Maiden, but it was the warmest time he had ever felt. Being hugged by Luo Fan, an extremely satisfied smile appeared on the Sky Maiden's face. She gently hugged Luo Fan back. It was his own will to keep the Sky Maiden in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. At that time, as his clone and his main body had fused, he felt that his main body was slightly incompatible. It was as if he was carrying an extremely heavy burden that was constantly eroding his view of the world. Therefore, he did not have time to do anything else. He controlled the connate inextinguishable spiritual light and turned it into a wisdom blade that began to slash the various comprehensions of his main body regarding the existence of the true divine realm. At that time, he did not feel anything at all about the changes in the outside world. It was only when the Sky Maiden screamed and crashed into the gray existence that he sensed something. He sensed that the Sky Maiden was in danger. At that time, he diverted his attention to control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to stop the process of slashing his comprehensions. It left his body and slashed the Sky Maiden's location, keeping her in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. After entering the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, the Sky Maiden was a little panicked and worried at first. However, she soon sensed the traces that Luo Fan had left here and gradually understood that this strange thing was not harming Luo Fan. Instead, it was very likely that Luo Fan was controlling it to carry out some kind of cultivation that she could not understand. After understanding this, she was slightly relieved. In the long years, she began to walk and cultivate in the various worlds within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Suddenly, the Sky Maiden noticed the 3-year-old child lying behind Luo Fan. She was slightly shocked and asked, "What's this?" Chapter 1760. Hearing this, the child behind Luo Fan had a bright smile on his face. He threw himself at the air hostess with open arms and said, "Coo!" His cuteness was off the charts, causing the air hostess's doubts to disappear in the blink of an eye. She suddenly hugged the child and said, "How cute!" Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but feel helpless. He did not expect that the air hostess, who had reached this level, could not escape the temptation of such a cute thing. However, this also saved him from having to explain more, so he was happy to see it happen. After a while, the air hostess asked, "Did you leave this world previously? Why do I feel that you have changed so much this time?" Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, "That's right. I did leave this world as a clone. In other words, I left the Earth universe and entered another world of the same level as the Earth universe." Left the Earth universe. The air hostess could not help but be curious. After being Luo Fan's cultivation companion for such a long time, she had even learned the importance of the world view from Luo Fan, let alone Luo Fan's name for this world. Therefore, at this moment, she was quite clear about what the Earth universe Luo Fan meant. That's right. Luo Fan did not hesitate. With a thought, he instantly transmitted everything he had experienced in this world to the air hostess's mind through the spiritual connection. Of course, he naturally could not transmit the various comprehensions that he had comprehended to the air hostess at this moment. The comprehension of extermination wasn't just for show. Although the process of comprehension from back then still existed, all the principles and mysteries that he had comprehended had been completely forgotten. As for the power that he had grasped now, it was similar to the power that he had obtained after comprehending those mysteries and principles. It was completely deduced from his world view. Although the power did not weaken, however, the foundation was completely different from before. This kind of existence was meaningless to the air hostess, who had already established her own world view. The experience of hundreds of millions of years. Even for the air hostess, it was an extremely huge amount of information. Her mind received such a message. The air hostess's eyes instantly became blank. There were countless electric lights flashing in her mind. Countless thoughts were constantly being absorbed by her in this process. This kind of absorption was like experiencing everything that was described in the information. It was many times more powerful than the absorption of information by ordinary people. Under such circumstances, the process would naturally take a long time. After a whole year, the woman finally recovered from her daze, and a look of shock appeared on her face. I see. There is actually such a high-grade world. I am truly a frog at the bottom of a well. After turning around, the Space Maiden sighed and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, I used to pursue the level of the world. But now I understand that the level of the world is very important to other cultivators. But to cultivators like us who understand the importance of a unique worldview, it is not essential. Of the worldview. World. As long as it's perfect enough, it's more than enough for us. Tian is good enough. Tian is Chen. Hearing this, the air hostess nodded and her eyes became clear. Then, she suddenly said, Why didn't you bring Qing Yi and Yuji here? Didn't I say that the passage only supported me and not them? Luo Fan said helplessly. He naturally knew what the air hostess meant. It was obvious that she had a problem with him treating the two of them so well, however. He didn't care much about this. After all, the air hostess had always been too calm and indifferent. She had even reached the point of indifference. Although she was much better than before, she still didn't seem to care about anything. Under such circumstances, her sudden emotional fluctuation made Luo Fan feel even more warm. Since you can keep me in the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura, it shouldn't be a problem to keep them in here, right? The air hostess said calmly. How can it not be a problem? Although they can be kept in here, their connate inextinguishable spiritual aura can't. In order to keep them in here, they have to give up on the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura. Needless to say, the loss outweighs the gain. Luo Fan only smiled. The air hostess thought for a while and finally nodded. Indeed. Seeing this, Luo Fan quickly changed the topic and began to talk about the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura. He told the air hostess about the classification of the level 9 world. After hearing this, the air hostess quickly broke away from her previous unhappiness and began to listen to Luo Fan's narration carefully. She already knew Luo Fan's intention when she first understood what this place was. She knew that from then on, this place should be her permanent place of cultivation. She would only be able to leave the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura when she truly broke through and became a true sage. Under such circumstances, it would naturally be better for her to have a deeper understanding of this place, and the faster her cultivation speed would be. After Luo Fan's narration attracted the air hostess's attention, he heaved a sigh of relief. Just as the air hostess had thought, he had indeed planned to completely place the air hostess in the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura. The connate inextinguishable spiritual aura was an existence that could exist for a long time in the state of chaos. Such an existence was even safer than the perfect world. After all, the perfect world still had a great calamity of the world. Once it couldn't be overcome, the world would be completely destroyed. In this way, it was obvious that even if it was a perfect world, there was still a possibility of death for living beings in it. However, the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura was different. Even if the perfect world was destroyed, the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura would not be damaged. Even if it sank into the state of chaos, all living beings in it could still exist forever. Apart from this, there were so many worlds in the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura, and the laws of the worlds were complicated and profound. They had all reached the limits of one's imagination. However, it was enough for the air hostess to perfect her view of the world. Wasn't such a safe and suitable place for cultivation the best place for the air hostess? As for the world that he had created with the help of the Supreme Venerable's treasure from the state of chaos, that imperfect perfect world was now dispensable to him. He had originally planned to let it go through the 9 great calamities. From there, he would raise its level to the level of the great world. In the end, he would be free of calamities and obtain endless time to cultivate and pursue becoming a saint. However, its function had now been replaced by the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura. Moreover, after experiencing the horror of the great calamity of the world, he knew that the possibility of this world surviving the 9 great calamities was extremely slim. It could almost be said to be impossible. In this case, he naturally couldn't value this world as much as before. The most suitable place for you to cultivate now should be the level 1 world. However, this world isn't a level 1 world, but a level 3 world. For the time being, it's not suitable for you to cultivate here, Luo Fan finally said to the air hostess after a brief explanation. Hearing this, the air hostess nodded and said, I see. No wonder I've always felt that the principles of this world are too profound. It's a little unbearable to my view of the world. Luo Fan smiled. Pulling the air hostess along, he teleported and arrived in a level 1 world among the many worlds. After arriving here, he didn't leave. Instead, he walked in this world with the air hostess for tens of thousands of years, continuously guiding the air hostess in her cultivation. Through his own cultivation process, he reversed some of the detours that she had taken and guided her to the most correct and direct path. Because of his help, the air hostess had actually broken through many realms in just 10,000 years and reached the false saint level. Moreover, due to the uniqueness of the connate inextinguishable spiritual aura, this false saint didn't need to integrate with any world at all. It was almost like she had stepped onto the path that Luo Fan had taken in the past. What matched this realm was her view of the world. It had also been perfected to the false saint level, although she was extremely far away from Luo Fan. Given her current state, even ordinary desperados wouldn't dare to say that they would definitely win against her. On this day, the air hostess completed her cultivation and said in satisfaction, I didn't expect that I would break through to this level in such a short time. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, It's very easy to break through to this level. However, it won't be so easy to continue breaking through. Your current view of the world is compatible with your cultivation. There are 2 things you need to cultivate next. First, work hard to perfect your view of the world. Second, try your best to integrate your view of the world with everything you have. Only when your view of the world is integrated with everything you have can it be considered a view that truly belongs to you. Only then can you truly embark on the correct path to become a true saint. Hearing this, the air hostess smiled blissfully and nodded. To the air hostess, these 10,000 years of cultivation could be said to be the happiest time of her life. In fact, it was even happier than the time she spent with Luo Fan back then. This was because during these 10,000 years, she could feel Luo Fan's unreserved trust in her. She also felt that she was following Luo Fan towards the true ultimate goal. This feeling of moving forward hand in hand was what she was most looking forward to. The air hostess felt extremely happy and blissful. Luo Fan also felt extremely relaxed. Throughout the 10,000 years of guiding the air hostess in her cultivation, he also felt an indescribable warmth lingering in his heart. Even his soul was inexplicably sublimated because of this warmth, and there were all sorts of indescribable happiness emerging from the bottom of his heart out of nowhere. Apart from this feeling of his soul, his cultivation was not dragged down at all. On the contrary, in the process of guiding the air hostess in her cultivation, he vaguely felt that his understanding of the world had become deeper. His understanding of his future path had also become clearer. After a slight sigh, Luo Fan said to the air hostess, All right, I've told you all that I can guide you. Now you can cultivate on your own. Hearing this, the air hostess's eyes were filled with reluctance, but she still knew that this was bound to happen. After all, although they were cultivation companions, they also had their own cultivation. It was impossible for them to be together for a long time. Therefore, she nodded and said, "Be careful." Luo Fan smiled and said, "Don't worry." With that, he hugged the air hostess. As he spoke, he hugged the air hostess. He turned around and took a step forward. His figure was already out of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light. After returning to the outside of the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, he casually grabbed it, and the natural inextinguishable spiritual light integrated into his body. It seemed as if it did not exist at all. In the Earth's universe, he was not invincible. He naturally could not do something as arrogant as hanging the natural inextinguishable spiritual light behind his head anymore. After putting away the natural inextinguishable spiritual light, he had a thought. The situation of this world had already been completely imprinted in his heart. This part of the world had already passed through 7 great tribulations. Now, the time dimension had unknowingly become the same as the time dimension of the Earth's universe. Moreover, it seemed that because both of them had gone through the same number of tribulations, his world had now been expelled out of the Earth's universe. Of course, although it had been expelled out of the Earth's universe, it did not mean that it was completely separated from the Earth's universe. In fact, the current world was like the world that he had stayed in for hundreds of millions of years. It had become a perfect world that was completely connected to the Earth's universe. After going through so many major tribulations, this world itself had become a perfect world that was completely connected to the Earth's universe. It had become completely different from before. Now, the entire world was tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of times bigger than before. Compared to the perfect world from before, although it was much weaker, its size was already not much different compared to the Earth's universe and the cultivation civilization in this world. Unknowingly, it had risen to an inconceivable level. Now, the strongest person in this world was no longer a false saint. Instead, it was a supreme emperor. Although it was only a second-level supreme emperor, compared to before, it had already increased by tens of thousands of times. In the entire world, there were 7 supreme emperors. Under this, the number of false saints and desperation added up. There were more than 10,000 of them. Further down was the number of false saints and quasi-saints. There were millions of times more than that. Unknowingly, it has already developed to this level. Luo Fan sighed slightly. The population of the entire world had almost exceeded the limit of numbers. But, because of the vastness of the world, there were so many people distributed in this world, but it even seemed to be quite sparsely populated. Among them, there were many cultivators and powerhouses distributed among the people, and they seemed to be extremely sparse. At this moment, where Luo Fan was, he was under the 8th layer of laws of this world, in a position that even the supreme emperors could not reach. Below him, above the 7th layer of laws and regulations, the 7 exalted emperors had opened up 7 cavern abodes. In other words, they were 7 independent spaces. These spacetimes were also developing prosperous civilizations, and there were powerhouses being born from them at every moment. Below this was the 6th layer of rules and laws, which was the level of desperation. There were 360 desperation men who had opened up 360 spacetime spaces in this place. Although these spacetimes were considered independent, each spacetime was inextricably linked to the spacetime of a certain supreme emperor. It was as if the spacetime of the supreme emperor was their spacetime of heaven, immortal world, or God world. Above the 5th layer of laws was the spacetime opened up by those false saints. There were more than 9,000 of them. Their spacetime was also inextricably linked to the spacetime of the desperation above. They also treated those spacetimes as their spacetime of heaven, immortal world, and God world. In fact, at this moment, when Luo Fan was watching, He could even see the living beings in it flying to a certain spacetime above. On the fourth level, there was no longer such a pattern. There were countless spacetimes or spacetime fragments densely packed there. They mixed together in an extremely chaotic manner, forming an indescribable isolation layer that isolated the fourth layer of laws from the fifth layer of laws. This made it even more difficult for the cultivators to reach the fifth layer of laws. In the third layer of laws, the second layer of laws, and the first layer of laws, there was no longer any spacetime. However, although there was no spacetime, there were countless strange living beings living in it. There were all kinds of strange living beings, and Luo Fan had never seen them in any other world. He had never seen them in any spacetime. Their essence was between reality and illusion, and they seemed to be real. At the same time, they seemed to be illusory. They did not exist by relying on spacetime, but by relying on laws. They wandered between the layers of laws, constantly absorbing the little bit of power produced by the circulation of laws, using it to maintain their lives. During this process, they released all kinds of indescribable power, nourishing the layers of laws, allowing the laws within to grow indescribably through this process. Luo Fan analyzed it for a while and discovered there were almost more than 10 million types of living beings. Some of them were weak, and even ordinary people could easily deal with them and control them. As for the powerful ones, even false saints had to be careful when dealing with them. Of course, no matter how strong they were, they could only be at the level of false saints. False saints were among them. They were already absolutely invincible existences. The lower the layer of laws, the weaker the number of living beings. Until the normal layer of spacetime, these kinds of living beings had completely disappeared. And the spacetime of this world, after being tempered and enhanced by the great tribulation of heaven and earth, had now risen to an unbelievable level. The stability of the space and the stability of time had reached an incomparably shocking level. Furthermore, even innate grand heavenly realm cultivators would need to expend an extremely great amount of energy to move spacetime. But, because the layers of laws of this world were divided according to complexity, this caused the number of cultivators in this world to be higher than any other world. Moreover, perhaps because of the various kinds of living beings in the layer of laws, this world had developed various cultivation systems that were based on these living beings. Countless cultivators used the characteristics of these living beings to let their senses enter the layer of laws. They used the characteristics of these living beings to comprehend the profundities of the laws, thus improving their own life. Apart from that, there was also a cultivation system that relied on these living beings to fight. Just like summoners, they used various methods to sign contracts with these living beings and activated the contracts during battles. They used their own power to give these living beings a physical form in the real world to fight for them and obtain everything they wanted for them. Luo Fan looked at the completely unfamiliar evolution of the world that he had opened up, and an inexplicable interest suddenly arose in his heart. With a move of his body, he instantly crossed the layers of rules and laws and arrived at the normal spacetime layer. The place where he appeared was on top of a precipitous peak. The vitality of this peak was so dense that it had even turned into liquid. It made the peak that was millions of meters high in the sky look like it was at the bottom of the sea. In fact, there were even some strange fish that were born in this yuan qi, and they were swimming and living in it. When Luo Fan arrived, he made a grabbing motion in the air. Among the surrounding essence qi, strands of silk were caught in his hand. This is the evolution of laws. He looked at the threads with an inexplicable smile on his face. Although the function of this world that supported him to exist in the state of chaos had disappeared, the evolution function of the world of laws had been strengthened instead. In particular, after losing his control and being tempered time and time again by the great tribulations of the world, the evolution became closer and closer to the essence of the world of laws and vividly displayed the profundities of the world of laws. Based on his understanding of the world of laws, He clearly knew that the threads in front of him were an extremely pure product of evolution after being tempered by the great tribulation of the world of laws several times. Chapter 1761. Looking at the evolving threads, Luo Fan casually shook his hand, and the threads poured into the void. As the layers of laws and laws were connected, all sorts of profound principles and mysteries surged out from the layers of laws and laws with the help of these threads, slowly fusing with this space-time. These principles and mysteries were so mysterious that after they merged with space-time, everything on this mountain began to undergo indescribable changes. Indistinctly, inexplicable worlds began to form here. There were all sorts of strange worlds, but they all followed a set of fundamental principles. That was the fundamental principle of the nomological worldview. Moreover, they didn't follow the complete nomological worldview, but rather a very small part of it. Under normal circumstances, it was simply impossible to stabilize space-time and stabilize the world. These worlds frantically absorbed the surrounding origin energy, causing the endless origin energy to constantly pour into them, causing the worlds to evolve into all kinds of indescribable creatures. These creatures were vaguely similar to the seemingly real and illusory creatures that existed between the layers of laws and laws. They relied entirely on the power released by the circulation of laws and laws to survive. They also had the appearance of chaos. As he watched these worlds form, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The birth of these worlds didn't contain his will at all. All the evolution processes and the final results were the natural transformation of heaven and earth, the result of the interaction between the threads and the layers of laws and laws. Now that these worlds could reach this level, it was enough to see how mysterious the evolving threads were. With a slight movement in his heart, Luo Fan made a grabbing motion with his hand, and the threads shook once again. It had already been extracted from between the layers of laws and laws. As these threads were extracted, the constantly evolving worlds suddenly stabilized. Although they didn't collapse, they seemed to have completely lost their vitality. At most, they could only maintain their current appearance, and it was impossible for them to evolve further. As for those threads, in Luo Fan's hands, they had undergone a subtle change. It was as if it had been assimilated by the layer of laws and laws, gradually losing its original purity and gradually transforming into laws or laws. Luo Fan sighed when he saw the changes happening to the threads. He shook his body once again and poured the threads into the law layer just like before. It directly connected to the 8 layers of laws and laws that existed behind every spacetime at this moment, and even directly connected to the 8th layer of laws and laws. As these threads connected the law layer, countless higher-level principles and mysteries poured into these worlds through those threads, slowly causing those worlds to undergo all sorts of indescribable changes. These principles and mysteries were mixed together to form the power contained within the layers of rules and laws, yet they displayed characteristics that were different from any other place in this world. As these worlds evolved, they began to transform in a more and more complicated direction. In the end, in just a few days, these worlds had completely turned into a large cluster of extremely strange and complicated worlds. Among them, he was able to find principles and mysteries related to any layer of laws and laws. Some mysteries were extremely simple. Even if ordinary people saw them, they would be able to gain a lot from them. Some principles were extremely complicated, and even supreme emperors would be confused when they saw them. They had no idea what they were. This state of completely breaking boundaries and completely condensing all principles and mysteries was similar to the state of any other spacetime, but it was the first time it had appeared in this world. For a time, all sorts of inexplicable fluctuations were naturally released from these worlds and quickly spread across this vast and boundless world. Countless powerful cultivators gradually sensed the existence of these fluctuations during this process. They began to move towards the location of these fluctuations, Although the cultivation civilization in this world was not as prosperous as the perfect world that Luo Fan had stayed in before, except for the fact that there were no true saints, it was slightly inferior to the Earth's universe. Everything else was not inferior to the Earth's universe at all. In such a world, how many powerful cultivators were hidden in it? But it was conceivable. At this moment, with the appearance of this kind of fluctuation that had a boundless attraction to many cultivators, how many cultivators would quickly rush over here? Was there any need to say more? After a few breaths of time, shadows began to appear in the sky one after another, quickly heading towards this mountain peak, or rather, this group of worlds. Seeing all these changes, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a thought in his heart, he lifted his foot and took a step forward, leaving the mountain peak. This place was an unexpected result of the power of the threads that he had evolved from the laws of law, but he was also happy to see it happen. This was because this place had broken the limits of this world. It made the originally strict hierarchical structure of this world lose its effect. In this place, living beings no longer needed to reach a certain realm to comprehend a certain layer of laws like before. Instead, they could comprehend all the layers of laws no matter what level they were at. This was obviously a good thing for this world. By dividing the layers of laws and making the simplest ones the easiest for living beings to sense, and the most complicated ones the hardest for living beings to sense. This was a pioneering work that Luo Fan was extremely proud of. The development of reality also proved the effectiveness of his pioneering work, causing the cultivation civilization of this world to become unprecedentedly prosperous. This world, which was originally extremely far away from Earth's universe, had unknowingly caught up to Earth's universe. In fact, it could even be said that Luo Fan's pioneering work had played a huge role in this world surviving so many great tribulations. But this did not mean that his work was perfect, and there were no disadvantages at all. Dividing the layers of laws and laws into layers indeed made it easier for living beings to embark on the path of cultivation. This made it even easier for cultivators to improve. But at the same time, it also limited the development of some heavenly geniuses. The number of living beings in this world had almost surpassed the limits of the numbers. Among them, there were naturally existences who could comprehend the mysteries of the seventh or eighth layer of laws and laws at the mortal level. There was also no lack of existences whose cultivation was extremely low, but who could comprehend higher levels. These existences had originally been tightly restricted by the layers of laws and laws, and their potential could not be unleashed at all. In the end, they might have died of depression due to some accident, and lost their original unlimited development possibilities. But now, with these clusters of worlds, the situation was different. In this cosmos group, to be able to break through all the restrictions, this kind of genius would naturally be able to comprehend more and obtain more in the end. They might even be able to greatly increase the power of this world's upper echelons. Of course, this was just a casual move that Luo Fan took. It did not matter to him what effect it could achieve or how great it was. In the next few years, Luo Fan continued to walk between the heavens and the earth. Occasionally, when he found something good, he would stop and casually deal with it. He made all sorts of strange things evolve there, forming all sorts of scenes of different natures. When to stop, when to start walking, what methods to use to change the place, whether to change it, and so on and so forth. All of this was done casually and according to his heart. But there was no complete plan at all. And this led to a result, which was, in the past few years there were all sorts of creatures in this world. Something attractive to some cultivators appeared. As a result, the many living beings and cultivators became much livelier than before. The world that was about to turn into stagnant water was unknowingly activated during this process. Luo Fan didn't try to hide his actions, although his actions were very subtle and hard to detect. However, after all, his actions were too many, and the number of changes was also too many. Therefore, after a few years, His existence was finally discovered by the 7 supreme martial emperors of this world. On this day, Luo Fan was standing in front of a deep pool. Suddenly, the void trembled and layers of multicolored light descended from the sky, falling into the deep pool. Following that, one figure after another gradually walked out from the light. Finally, all 7 men and women appeared before Luo Fan and looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable gaze. You should have guessed my identity by now, right? Luo Fan looked at them and smiled faintly. This world was created by him, so he had supreme authority here. Nothing in this world could hide from him even if he was just a mortal. Moreover, he was a level 3 supreme ruler who had grasped the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. His strength was hundreds or even thousands of times stronger than the supreme rulers before him. In such a state, how could the actions of these 7 supreme emperors escape his notice? The expressions of the 7 supreme emperors became a little excited. They bowed to Luo Fan one by one, greeting their creator. You've done well in the years I wasn't here. Now that this world has grown to this level, it's all thanks to you. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said. These supreme emperors had completely taken Luo Fan's worldview as their own worldview, and they had grown based on the development of the worldview. Luo Fan had an indescribable sense of intimacy towards them. Therefore, his attitude towards them was rather good, as if they were his own disciples. Even Luo Fan felt this way, so the feelings of these supreme rulers would only be stronger and even more uncontrollable. If that wasn't the case, why would the 7 of them appear before Luo Fan at the same time instead of letting 1 or 2 of them test the waters before making a decision? Thank you for your compliment, Creator. This is what we should do. The 7 men and women couldn't hide their excitement. However, the upcoming 8th tribulation will be the greatest challenge this world has faced since its creation. You must be prepared, Luo Fan said to them with a slightly solemn expression. The 8th apocalypse of heaven and earth. The Supreme Emperor's expressions changed drastically. Although they had already helped this world survive the 7th tribulation, the previous tribulations made them clearly aware of the changes of this world's tribulation. Laurel City. These people, even the 7th Great Tribulation of the heavens and earth, had barely survived. Now that they heard that the 8th tribulation was coming, it went without saying how they felt. May I ask, Creator? When will the 8th tribulation descend? One of the female supreme sovereigns asked. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, based on the development of this world, there are still 8 billion years. 8 billion years. Hearing this, the 7 supreme rulers' expressions relaxed. 8 billion years. Hearing this, the expressions of the 7 supreme martial emperors relaxed. After all, they couldn't compare to the supreme rulers in that perfect world. Every one of them had experienced billions of trillions of years of time. Even the oldest among them had only lived for tens of billions of years. For people like them, 8 billion years was not considered a short period of time. Seeing their expressions relax, Luo Fan sighed slightly in his heart. He knew that the foundation of this world was ultimately not as good as that of other worlds. Even in the Earth universe, when those pseudo-sage saints heard that there would be a great tribulation of heaven and earth in more than 3 billion years, they would feel an indescribable sense of urgency. In that perfect world, when those supreme emperors heard this, they would feel as if they were taking a nap and the tribulation would arrive. However, in this world that they had created, the strongest supreme rulers actually felt relaxed about these 8 billion years. They actually felt that this time was very long from the small to the big. One could naturally see what their understanding of time was like. Luo Fan didn't show this attitude of his. After all, this concept of time could only be changed after experiencing it. Now, even if he said that 8 billion years would pass very quickly, and that it would be gone in a nap, they wouldn't take it to heart. Even if they displayed an extremely urgent attitude on the surface, they would definitely be relaxed in their hearts. If that was the case, why waste their saliva and energy? At that moment, he just said, however, according to my calculations of this world, even with me, the possibility of this world surviving the eighth tribulation of the world is less than 5%. These words, in an instant, the expressions of the seven supreme rulers changed drastically. Less than 5%? They almost exclaimed at the same time. 5%. This was a very small probability, no matter where it was, not to mention that it was in this world, although these supreme rulers had already barely helped this world survive the seventh tribulation of the world. According to their own strength, the possibility of surviving the eighth tribulation of the world was indeed very small. However, after all, there was still this Creator who was countless times more powerful than them here, wasn't there? Because of Luo Fan, they naturally had that inexplicable expectation about whether this world could survive the eighth tribulation of the world. Now that their expectations had been dashed, how could they not be shocked? At this time, how could they still look relaxed? This was like a person who clearly knew that he was going to die, but if he knew the specific day of his death, he would inevitably feel a sense of urgency in his heart, and would inevitably want to try his best to prolong the date of death. Even if that date might be a few decades later, there would be no exception. Right now, these supreme rulers were clearly in this situation. Previously, when they heard that the tribulation of the world would only descend in 1.8 billion years, they felt that there was still a long time and naturally felt relaxed. But now that they heard that the possibility of surviving the tribulation of the world was so small, they naturally understood that the 1.8 billion years was not the time of the tribulation of the world, but the time of their own death. How could their mentality not change? Creator, please save us. These supreme sovereigns bowed to Luo Fan one by one and said. Seeing their behavior, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Do you still think that it's a long time?" These words caused the faces of the supreme sovereigns to turn red. That's too short of a time. Luo Fan's smile unknowingly turned into a sigh. He said, "This is the limit of this world. When I first opened up this world, because I used a trick, the foundation of this world itself was extremely weak. To be able to survive the seventh tribulation of the world is already beyond my expectations. It's just too difficult for him to survive the eighth great tribulation. Isn't there still a 5% chance of success? Is there no way to increase this 5%? The female supreme ruler said with great anticipation. This 5%. I've already used all methods to calculate and increase the success rate. Under normal circumstances, it's not even 1 in 10,000, Luo Fan said faintly. Hearing this, despair appeared on the faces of the few of them. Luo Fan shook his head. Forget it. After all, there is still a 5% chance. We can't give up. Next, all of you need to work hard and increase your cultivation level as much as possible. That's the only way to increase the success rate. Increase my Tao cultivation realm? At this moment, the supreme rulers smiled bitterly. Luo Fan frowned. Creator, it's not that we don't want to work hard to increase our cultivation level. It's just that we are all stuck at a bottleneck. No matter how hard we try, we are stuck here. It's been tens of thousands of years since we've felt any progress in our cultivation level. Now we are even wondering if there's a realm above us. One of the supreme rulers smiled bitterly. Hearing this, Luo Fan couldn't help but laugh. There's no realm above us? What a joke. This caused the expressions of the supreme emperors to turn solemn. This wasn't because they were angered by Luo Fan's words. It was because they knew that this was a rare opportunity. From what Luo Fan said next, they would definitely be able to obtain some of the benefits they were looking forward to. There is no limit to cultivation. Luo Fan's expression became unprecedentedly firm. His eyes were burning as he looked at the 7 supreme emperors in front of him, who had a very close relationship with him. His expression was as if he was speaking the absolute truth. There is no limit. The 7 supreme rulers were deep in thought. That's right. No matter what level you cultivate to, even if you're at the true sage level, there must be a higher realm and a possibility of improvement. You can't find a higher realm and you can't find a possibility of improvement. Then there was only one possibility, and that was, you're on the wrong path. Luo Fan said very seriously. These words fell into the ears of the 7 supreme sovereigns. However, it was like a thunderclap that shook the heavens, instantly causing the 7 supreme emperors to reveal expressions of extreme shock on their faces. There is no limit. I'm on the wrong path. They all murmured. There was hope and despair in the depths of their eyes. They hoped that they knew that they could continue cultivating online and that they still had a goal to strive for. What made them feel despair was that they suddenly started to doubt whether they had taken the wrong path from the start. Only you know the path that you're cultivating. If it was before, I could still guide you. But now, I'm on a completely different path from you. There's nothing that can guide you anymore. Therefore, you can only rely on yourselves for your cultivation from now on, Luo Fan said with some regret. In the past, Luo Fan had memorized countless principles and mysteries of the true sage level. Any one of them would be enough for these supreme rulers to comprehend. If that had been the case, it would have been a matter of minutes if he wanted to guide them and preach to them. However, it was different now. He had already completely destroyed all of his understanding of the true saint stage, and there was nothing left for them to listen to. It was because of this that Luo Fan said such words.